something that I announced yesterday about no longer being a part of the Aaron Abke event. The big push of Kelly's Essene Gospel of Peace had a new life born into it by Aaron Abke and many other of these New Age teachers that have no basis in history. And the idea of Jeshua being mentioned in the Essene writings, the idea that he was a vegetarian, there is no documented evidence of it. None.
John Davis claims to remember Jeshua, as he calls him, in his past lives. And so John has made numerous of these videos mentioning me by name, and again, has tagged me in some of them. You don't just get to come along and start insulting and belittling the research of other people because you have some private visions. We are devout students of history and biblical scholarship because we don't want to make a Jesus in our own image, as John is claiming. The first big red flag for us is that John claims to remember that everyone called Yeshua Jeshua with a J. So John will need to forgive us today for being skeptical of some of his past life memories, when right off the bat, he's claiming that Jesus was called an impossible name. It doesn't exactly lend itself to credibility.
He's beating up this straw man that is full inversion and fabrication of what we teach. It's clear he just never watched anything that we've ever said, I think.
Seems like John really wants to have this debate with us, so we're happy to oblige. Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you, my friends, and welcome back to the Jesus Way podcast. We've got an exciting episode today because the trio is back. We got Cam back in studio with us today, which is a great pleasure because, Cam, you've been moving all over God's creation and it's been hard to get a hold of you for the last couple months. So welcome back to the pod, man.
Thanks, it's good to be here. I'm in my Airstream still as we speak, what I visited you guys in Austin. Probably the text messages aren't always coming through because of the tin on the outside of this. It's kind of my own little like Faraday cage here.
Nice. Block out those EMFs, bro. Well, we're just going to go ahead and dive right into today's video because we've got a walloper of a podcast to go through today, because today we're doing a response video to some claims made about us in several different videos by a New Age teacher named John Davis, who claims to be the reincarnation of the disciple John. To give you a little context for why John's been making these videos about us, I'll give you the backstory. We've been preparing for a big Jesus Way summit at the end of December this year, where we're going to have about 30 guest speakers talking about Yeshua's teachings, concepts like Christ consciousness and the Jesus Way. And so John Davis was recommended to us by someone, and so James did an intake call with him to get a kind of feel for his teachings and beliefs. And right away, John said that he disagrees with us that Jesus was, emerged from Essene-type Judaism, or that he was a vegetarian. And he also made some other pretty wild claims about us on that call that we're going to get into. But suffice to say, it was clear to James that this wasn't going to be a fit for our summit. And so we emailed John and thanked him for his time, but just told him it felt like it wasn't going to be a great fit for us. And a few days later, John made this video, which we're going to react to today, accusing us of teaching false things with no historical evidence, and said that we teach things that are dangerous and damaging to people on our podcast. And so then he went on to make several more of these videos and even tagging me in some of them. And many of you have sent us some of these videos over the last few weeks and asked for us to respond. Now, as you guys know, I get videos made about me all the time by Christian apologists and almost never feel the need to respond to them. But this one was a little bit different because John Davis is actually adjacent to us in many ways, in that he is anti-religion. He's very skeptical of Paul and believes Paul corrupted Christianity. But for some reason, he seems to really want to have this debate with us nonetheless. And he seems to have big problems with the idea that Jesus was completely nonviolent and against animal murder. And so John has made numerous of these videos mentioning me by name, and again, has tagged me in some of them. And so it seems like John really wants to have this debate with us, so we're happy to oblige. We think that it's healthy to show what a respectful debate or disagreement can look like. And these conversations also give us guys a really good chance to clarify the Jesus Way message all the more, which is what this podcast is all about. So it's a win-win in our book. But with that being said, this is a bit of a tightrope for us to walk today, because this isn't really a typical debate of my evidence versus your evidence. It's a little more complicated than that, because, again, John is specifically refuting our research on the basis of his own private visions. not on actual historical data he's gathered from his own critical research. John Davis claims to remember Jeshua, as he calls him, in his past lives, and he claims to know that Jeshua had no connection to the Essenes and was definitely not a vegetarian, but an avid flesh eater, all based on his own visionary memories and past life regressions. And so the difficulty of this is that our debunking of John's claims about the historical Jesus obviously calls into question the validity of his claim to be the reincarnation of the disciple John. But to be fair, that's not really our problem. And we didn't go looking for this debate, John did. So, private visions aside, we're just going to weigh some of John's claims against the historical evidence today and let the viewers draw their own conclusions. But secondly, we want to be abundantly clear that although we may disagree on some things with John, we love John Davis. He is also our brother in Christ. And so we want to be very clear that we are not accusing John today of being a fraud or lying about his claims or any such thing. For all we know, John may really believe these visions he has. And so that's between him and God. We're simply going to show you some of the big red flags that we've seen in just 3 or 4 of his videos that we've watched. And so before we get into some of those red flags, anything that you guys would like to add before we dive in?
Yeah, Aaron, I agree with so much that you shared. And when I first heard about John, I was very surprised by a lot of his claims that I know we're going to cover today. But what I was most surprised by is that, you know, when I created the film Christspiracy and went to the world with it in theaters and everything, I expected to get pushback, especially from Christians, and I have. But the one thing that wasn't on my 2025 bingo card was getting refuted by the beloved Apostle John himself, as John claims to be. So this will make it a pretty interesting podcast, I think, to go into some of his claims and also some of the claims from his gospel written in his past life.
Yeah, life is full of surprises, isn't it? It's interesting because there's been a couple of videos over the last few weeks. People have been sending them to us, and then he started tagging me in them. And we're going to watch, I think, 3 of them today. But he actually just posted another one this morning that we saw. And so we're going to react to that video as well. It's all kind of around the same claims, but it gives us an opportunity to clarify a few things. But let's start with this, you guys. In all honesty, the first big red flag for us when we started watching John Davis, within just a few seconds of listening to John speak, is that John claims to remember that everyone called Yeshua Jeshua, like with a J. And the first time I heard John say this, my jaw about hit my desk. I struggle to put into words for the viewer just how extremely anachronistic this claim is. But I'm going to try to break it down for you. Because you don't even have to study Semitic languages to know that there is no J letter or sound in any Semitic language, not in the 1st century, nor today. But it's even worse than that, because the letter J did not exist in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, or Latin in the time of Jesus. No ancient text, Hebrew, Greek, or Latin ever records Jeshua as a person's name, let alone as Yeshua's name. The letter J is a modern English invention from around the 14th century. Yeshua spoke Aramaic and Hebrew, as we know, and there is no J sound or letter in either language. In Hebrew, he was called Yehoshua, or Yeshua for short, and in Aramaic, Isa. So all of the J names that we give to these biblical characters, like Jesus, Joseph, John, James, these are English renderings of Hebrew names, in which the Y sound is the Hebrew consonant letter Yod. Every Semitic name beginning with Yod retains the Y sound in all related toponyms. There are no Semitic toponyms or personal names beginning with a J. This is a medieval English letter. So Jeshua doesn't exist in any historical manuscript or linguistic language. Jeshua is like a linguistic Frankenstein name, where you take the 14th century English letter J and then graft it onto the front of the Hebrew name Yeshua by removing the Hebrew letter Yod. So it's like a crossbreed of 2 completely different languages from different time periods. But again, it's even worse than that, because John also mispronounces the name by putting the accented syllable at the front of the name, saying it Jeshua. But in Hebrew, Yeshua's name ends with a guttural letter, the ayin, which means that the accented symbol is at the end, not the beginning of the name. So it's pronounced Yeshua, not Yeshua or Jeshua. So no matter what way you slice it, this name cannot possibly come from John's historical memories because it is quite literally incorrect in every conceivable way. So I find it a bit ironic that John continually says that we're just a bunch of New Age apologists with no historical evidence to back up what we say, but John's out here telling people that his real name was Jeshua. So I'll leave it at that. Anything you guys want to add?
Well, this was one of the things that really caught me off guard on our phone call. And I will say, John was a sweet guy. He was very nice, but I just started picking up on some of these patterns, the Jeshua, several other claims we could get into later that I guess my spidey senses started going off. And, Aaron, Cam, and myself are really immersed in the historical critical scholarship. And like Aaron said, it's an impossibility really that he would have been called Jeshua by his friends and disciples. So that was the first red flag of many. And I don't mean that as disrespect to John, but it is what it is.
Yeah, and I, hate to drop a dad joke, but I guess because I'm a dad now, I can do it. But when I first heard it, I was thinking he was joking. It was just so crazy. So then, there's the old phrase, just joshing with someone. I was like, oh, this guy's just Jeshuing. He's just Jeshuing us right now. There's no way that this is real, but
great dad.
He is claiming it. Yeah. So, thanks for clearing that up with the history there, Aaron. There was some stuff I even learned in that breakdown.
Nice. We're never too old to learn something new, right? And I want to say this too, guys, like, in one sense, I don't fault John for thinking that some of the things we share sound crazy, because anybody who doesn't really study early Christian history, such as Christians, think that we sound really crazy, right? Because everything we're saying contradicts conventional thinking. But this is what we're trying to do on this podcast, right? One of the purposes of this podcast is to blow the lid on this scandalous Christian history that there was a lost Christian sect or movement at the beginning of the Jesus movement that's been washed over and covered up, that the first Christians were not the proto-Catholic Orthodox or even the Gnostics, but they were the Nazarenes. And we're going to show you widespread attestation of this today. But for John to be making so many of these extreme claims and judgments about us, when he's obviously not watched any of our content, is honestly quite surprising to me. Because if John had watched even one video of us breaking down these topics, he would see that virtually all that we do on this podcast is drop historical proofs and scholarly evidence to demonstrate our claims. We're literally Bible history geeks, you guys, who spend hours of our day researching biblical scholarship and reading ancient manuscripts. For crying out loud, I'm taking my freaking master's degree in this right now in biblical studies. I read and study biblical Hebrew daily. We do podcast prep sessions every Monday night, James, for this podcast to put these walloping presentations together, which take us hours and hours of prep. So for John to claim that we're just a bunch of New Agers making things up with no historical proof could not be more incorrect. And it would surprise me that somebody would make a claim like that without having ever researched the person they're claiming it about, right? When you debate somebody or you want to debate somebody, the first thing you have to do is research what they actually think and believe and their arguments. If you want to actually debate the substance of the matter, you want to know what your opponent really thinks. And this is something that always happens to us, right, Cam? Our opponents always make these straw man out of our arguments because they don't want to represent our true arguments, because it would show them to be valid to their audience, and they don't want to do that. So I guess we should just let this be a kind of good example to learn from of what happens when you rush to judgments and jump to conclusions about people. You're often going to be proven wrong and have to eat some humble pie. And that's why Jesus said, "Judge not, lest you be judged." So John will need to forgive us today for being skeptical of some of his past life memories, when right off the bat, he's claiming that Jesus was called an impossible name. It doesn't exactly lend itself to credibility. There are big problems that arise when someone tries to assert themselves as an authority figure or an expert on the basis of their own private visions. The New Age world is rife with people claiming to channel Jesus or Mary Magdalene and have past life memories with them, right? And they often say things that are egregiously false. And when you do that, you just tee up the Christian apologist to make a joke out of you and anyone who believes other than orthodoxy, right? So you don't just get to come along and start insulting and belittling the research of other people because you have some private visions. You can certainly say, hey, I've had these visions and past life memories, and here's what they are. Take it for what it's worth. That's perfectly fine. But when you start refuting people on the basis of your private visions, as if your visions are legitimate evidence for the truth, that's when it becomes a problem. All our viewers know how we feel about people who appeal to their private visions of Jesus. We don't believe that God reveals universal truths to one person in a private vision who then everyone else has to believe. But that's exactly what John is claiming here. Don't listen to these guys who pour countless hours of their lives into historical research. They're just a bunch of crazy New Agers. Believe me in my private visions of Jeshua. For me, it's a no thank you. I don't believe in the private visions of Joseph Smith or Muhammad or David Koresh, and certainly not Paul. So I'm going to be skeptical of anyone who claims something similarly, right? I'll stick with the historical evidence. Religion has already painted a false Greco-Roman Jesus for the last 2,000 years based on Paul's private visions. So we don't need anyone else coming along to do the same, right? We on this podcast think it's time for the true history of Christianity, scandalous though it may be, to finally come to light after 2,000 years of suppression. That's why on this podcast, we are devout students of history and biblical scholarship, because we don't want to make a Jesus in our own image, as John is claiming. We want to know what's really true. And guess what? We were not even vegetarians or aware of the Essene connections to Jesus when we began this research years ago. And what we began to find written on the pages of history absolutely shell-shocked us to our core and transformed us irreversibly. And we hear from countless numbers of our viewers on the Jesus Way podcast that this message has changed their lives too in the best way possible. So we hold this message in the highest possible reverence, and we are glad to defend it against its detractors, just as Jesus did, whether they be New Age, religious, or otherwise. So with that being said, guys, let's go ahead and jump into our first video of John Davis, and we'll just kind of go through some of the claims he makes one by one.
Something that I announced yesterday about no longer being a part of the Aaron Abke event. And I wanted to kind of really state my view on this ideology of Jeshua being an Essene and Jeshua being a vegetarian, because none of it is historically accurate. And when I did my intake interview with Aaron's co-host, I told him right up front that I don't believe he was a vegetarian, and I explained where the only writings that say he were came out of the Theosophical Society and Theosophical ideas of Reverend Owsley, who was the author of the Gospel of the Holy 12, which was a series of newspaper articles, and Edmund Jekeli, who wrote the Essene Gospel of Peace. Neither one of them ever backed up their writings with the source. They never actually showed any document that proved what they were saying. But this idea of Jeshua being an Essene or being a vegetarian is something that's out there in the ethos. People talk about this all the time. Dolores Cannon talked about these ideas. And what's so interesting is that, the only documented evidence we have of potentially the Essenes, the only documented writings we have that are potentially attributed to the Essenes, and I'm saying potentially on purpose because the writings don't say they're Essene writings. They're copies of the Torah, and the only documented version that they're possibly are attributed to the Essenes are the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are, as I said, they are copies of the Torah. They do not mention Jeshua or Jesus or any of that thing. They do talk about a potential Messiah coming, but they never name anybody by name. They never mention Jeshua once. They also, and here's the fascinating thing, they also never promote vegetarianism. There's nothing about vegetarianism. There's nothing about mystical arts in them. They are literally just text from the Torah. And these ideas that Jeshua was an Essene, that Jeshua was in a mystical school and came up and his mother was trained in the mystical school of the Essenes to bring the Messiah forward. The biggest problem with this whole concept is that Jeshua didn't believe he was a Messiah, nor did he believe in Messiahs. If you just look at the texts that are attributed to him, which once again, everything in the Bible is hearsay, but the texts that are attributed to him all say the kingdom of heaven is within you. Never says he's the Messiah once. He consistently says he's the Son of Man in the Bible.
Yikes. We're going to react to that in a moment, but I wanted to say one thing about the claim about Mary Magdalene or whatever being a arch leader of the Nazarene mystical order. I don't know where that comes from. I think he's just assuming we teach that, but we definitely don't teach that. I'm guessing it comes from the Theosophical Society, which John doesn't seem to like very much. But yeah, just wanted to clarify that.
He's not telling you that he is the Messiah. He's not telling you that he is some mystical teacher. He's literally saying that he found something within himself and for you to take heart because he overcame the world and so can you. Why are so many New Age teachers repeating this claim? Was he really an Essene? Was he really a vegetarian? What the historical sources say is that the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only text that have been potentially attributed to the Essenes, because as I said, they don't say they're Essenes, but it's being promoted as they are, and many scholars believe they may have been Essenes. But what are the Essenes? The Essenes are a Judaic sect, just like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So they are literally just a Judaic sect, and they never mention Jesus because they never had a Messiah show up. Classical writers like Josephus and Philo and Pliny, they describe Essene communal life as celibacy, purity, strict laws, but no connection to Jeshua. The Gospels say that Jeshua ate fish and lamb at the Passover meal, attended meals. He criticized overly rigid law. He said, woe to you keepers of the law, teachers of the law. And in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, which a lot of New Age people lead into, he literally says that it's not what goes in your mouth that defiles you, but what comes out. The idea that vegetarianism doesn't come into the story of this Essene mystical group until Madame Blavatsky in the late 1800s created the Theosophical Society, where she was trying to marry Hinduism into Christianity to try to make it a broader perspective and more accepting. Until that point, Jeshua was never linked with the Essenes, and there's no documented evidence of any Essene writings other than the Dead Sea Scrolls. So in my intake meeting, I very specifically had said that the Gospel of Thomas said it doesn't matter what goes in your mouth, what comes out is what's important. I explained Reverend Ousley's Gospel of the Holy 12, and I explained Edmund Kelly's Essene Gospel of Peace and the origins of those, and how both of those never had any proof. One of the things that really kind of stood out to me in my intake process for that event was after I had told them about the origins of these two documents, I was told flat out, well, we get this from the other Essene writings. Well, there are no other Essene writings. There's only the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls don't mention vegetarianism, and they don't mention Jeshua. So the idea that they're getting these ideas from other Essene writings, the only Essene writings that claim the things that they're claiming are the Gospel of the Holy 12 and the Essene Gospel of Peace, neither of which is a documented historical thing, and both of them have been exposed as frauds a long time ago. People want a Jeshua who matches their modern values, their modern ideas of compassion, peace, and nonviolence, and holistic health. But they're not looking at it from the perspective that all of these ideas that they're promoting are something outside of yourself that you have to do to create this within yourself. But the myth works, and it still resonates emotionally, but it's a projection from something that is not in any way, shape, or form historical. When they told me that they got their information from different Essene writings that I had just debunked for them, I knew full well that my time with them was done, because he literally told me that there were other Essene writings that do not exist. There are no other Essene writings.
So James, he's talking here about your intake call with him, and he's making a few claims about you and what you said. So I just wanted to pause this to let you kind of give your side of the story.
Well, just rewatching this now, it's really clear that he's upset or a bit offended that he was uninvited from the event. So now he's kind of lashing out, and I understand that might hurt someone's feelings, but he's completely strawmanning our position, and he's strawmanning the discussion we had on the phone, which I was you guys know me, I'm a little sweetheart. I was being very kind and nice to him, and I kind of realized that it wasn't a vibe between us, that we really don't agree on these core principles. So I was kind of just entertaining him. And he's going on his spiel about the Essenes, and I was like, okay, well, we use different sources. We have different historical attestations we look at. And that was kind of that. We didn't really get too deep into it.
So you didn't say, we get this from the other Essene writings, which he quoted you twice as saying.
No, it was really a short conversation because I was trying to get off the phone. And he's strawmanning our whole position about everything, as we're going to get into in the remainder of this presentation. It's all one big straw man. And John, unfortunately, has not really, he's displaying an extremely elementary knowledge of the things we discussed, the Essenes, the Nazarenes, the Ebionites. This is really surface level Googling. And I guess his own private visions play a part in it. But I'm almost saddened that we have to make this video, because I was like, all right, this isn't a fit. Let's just go our separate ways. I sent him a nice email, and I thought that would be that, but it really offended him. And he started making all this content about us. So we decided to respond, because really, more than anything, it's an opportunity to present all of the evidence in favor of this Essene philosophical connection and the vegetarian connection. So God gives you lemons, you make lemonade.
I want to also jump in and just clarify one thing that he says, because we all are very, very strict on our sourcing, and that's kind of what he's critiquing here. And we're going to get into all of the historical attestation from sources that scholars use across the board. But then he's also citing the Essene Gospel of Peace and the Gospel of the Holy 12. The Essene Gospel of Peace, we did a whole episode on, and I guess he didn't watch it, because throughout the entire episode, I was providing, everyone was, but especially I was providing, some pushback and some skepticism about how I viewed that text over the years, and held it a little bit with a grain of salt, even though I appreciate the writings that are there. But knowing that everything that's stated in that, writing is actually present in other widely accepted attestations that scholars use, like the patristic writings, etc. But then he's naming this Gospel of the Holy 12, which we've never talked about once. I've never talked about that writing ever publicly or even privately with anyone. It's not something I ever appeal to, so I don't know where he's getting that from.
We've also never spoken about the Theosophical Society. We've never studied them. We've never cited them. And he's acting like it's the absolute pillar, the foundation of our entire philosophy is the Theosophical Society, a group we've never really looked into and has zero influence on our spiritual philosophy whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, even in the Essene Gospel of Peace episode, we said clearly we don't use this as an historical attestation or record for our arguments. We just love the spiritual philosophy of it, and we think it aligns beautifully with the Jesus way. But we also did show some really striking attestations of especially the Elkoshites, a 1st through 4th century group that, of the attestations we have, matches perfectly with the type of Essenism we see in the Essene Gospel of Peace. So whether that book was written by an ancient Essene type of sect, like maybe the Elkoshites or something, we don't know, but we know that there was an ancient group living and believing, practicing angelology and all these things exactly as the Essene Gospel describes, which is interesting. And Dr. Eisenman's doing some really amazing scholarship on the Essene Gospel of Peace. And I think you said, Cam, he's starting to think that it might actually be or trace back to some kind of 1st century text, which is also interesting.
Exactly. To your point, this is an example of the kind of scholarship that we do, which is that we can read a document like the Essene Gospel of Peace, glean a lot from it, but hold it in the balance of, okay, is this early? Is this late? Where does this sit? And over our research, we have more and more progressive knowledge that's leaning in the direction that it could be an early document. And in fact, we may end up doing an episode in the future on it, because I've been in contact with a woman who is a scholar that's been researching it and has written a whole paper on why she believes it's actually from the 1st century. And to your point, Aaron, Robert Eisenman wrote the actual foreword, the introduction to this paper, claiming that he's signing off on her work, that he now, after seeing the work she's done, that he believes it is 1st century. So, that's very interesting, because he's one of the most cutting edge scholars when it comes to these documents, with all of his work with the Dead Sea Scrolls and everything. But I just also want to separate that from this whole Gospel of the Holy 12 claim that he's making, because we've never even talked about that document. So that's just a lie or a misunderstanding.
There's also a book I bought from a woman, and I can't remember her name because I have a billion books in my library, but she wrote a whole book on this topic, that she listened to the Vatican radio read the Essene Gospel of Peace I think they just called it the Gospel of Essenes. And she even names I think it was a Catholic Monsignor or a cardinal of some sort who read the text from the Vatican Library. And she wrote in and she shows the letters she wrote and everything to the Vatican, asking if she could see a copy of that document. And they said, no document ever leaves, the Vatican. And that's another thing we talked about in the Essene episode, is that the reason Edmond Bordeaux didn't have a document to furnish as proof is because his cardinal who gave him access to the archive said, you're allowed to translate this text, but no document can ever leave our library. So you can't go show this around to scholars and have them study it and whatnot. So in any case, there's a lot left to be said about the potential historicity of the Essene Gospel, but we do not use it as an historical source. We say that over and over again. And so again, it's just a kind of straw man. But the last thing on your take, James, is that John continually tries to paint that he chose to leave the summit because he talked to you and you said, we get this from other Essene writings, which you didn't say. And it's actually the reverse. You wrote him an email, which we'll put on the screen, where you said very kindly, hey, John, thanks again for taking the time to connect with me and brainstorm ideas for the summit. I really enjoyed our conversation and have a lot of respect for the thoughts that you bring to these topics. After further reflection with the team, we realized that since vegetarianism and the Essenian philosophical link to the early Christian movement are foundational principles for us, this year's summit may not be the best match for your session. We decided to go in a different direction. Grateful for your time and your spirit you brought to our call, wishing you the very best with all that you're working on. With gratitude, James. And he just responded to that email with, okay. And so we had a feeling he might have been offended by that. And, we were sorry for that, but it shouldn't be all that big of a deal if someone just says, hey, we believe different things, so it's just not going to be a fit. But obviously, John cares a lot about this topic of Jesus's Essene heritage and vegetarianism and all that. And I'm going to get into later in this podcast why I think that is. But for now, let's keep watching the video.
The big push of Kelly's Essene Gospel of Peace in the 1930s has recently had a new life born into it by Greg Braden and now Aaron Abke and many other of these New Age teachers who are leaning into these theosophical teachings that have no basis in history.
Okay, I want to say something about this.
I don't know that I've ever heard Greg Braden talk about the Essene Gospel of Peace either. I don't know where he's getting that from. Greg Braden talks about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but
right.
Anyways.
Yeah, it's just more assumptions from John here, I think. Again, if John had actually researched our content before making these claims, then he would know that I've never made a single video about anything from the Theosophical Society because I've never read or studied a single thing from the Theosophical Society in my life. Many of the concepts I teach may overlap with things that the Society teaches, but I honestly wouldn't know. I couldn't name for you a single Theosophical teacher until I watched this video from John and found out about Madame Blavatsky and so forth, who founded the Society. All cool, but all news to me. So I find it funny that John is kind of warning his audience about me being a theosophical teacher when I definitely know less about theosophy than John does. And, what John's doing here is kind of textbook ad hominem, right? Called guilt by association, which goes something like this. X is bad. You can't trust X because X is bad. And Aaron believes X, therefore Aaron is bad. It's a logical fallacy called false equivalency or guilt by association. And I'm actually quite certain, to your point too, Cam, that Greg Braden also would disagree that he's a Theosophical Society teacher, because if you're going to use this kind of logic, right, guilt by association, then I can just point out anything John believes that overlaps with the Theosophical Society and say, well, can't trust John now because he believes in oneness, just like Madame Blavatsky. And we know Madame Blavatsky was bad, therefore John is bad. The logic doesn't work because it can be used to discredit the arguer just as easily as their opponent. But let's continue.
This concept that the Essenes were a healing sect, they conflate this with another group known as the Therapeutai, or that's the Greek word for healers. But they were two separate groups. There was the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Therapeutai was something entirely different.
So just to stop it here, that's definitely not true. The Therapeutai, most scholars believe that they were kind of a Greek group of Essenes, I believe in Egypt and elsewhere, but they are definitely connected to the Essenes. I think Josephus actually compares the Therapeutai to the Essenes, and they have almost identical belief systems. So, we can't prove anything with 100% certainty about the ancient world. We can just look at where the evidence converges, and all the evidence converges that there was tons of similarities between the Essenes and the Therapeutai. and that they were likely just a Greek group of Essenes living in Egypt and elsewhere.
He wasn't an Essene, and he wasn't a vegetarian. He says, before Abraham was, I am. That's a quote from the Bible. Well, Abraham was a direct representation of the Judaic faith. For him to say, before Abraham was, I am, was saying, I do not subscribe to the teachings of Judaism. That's exactly what that quote means.
I do not subscribe to the teachings of Judaism.
That's exactly what that quote means.
Okay, who wants to take the first crack at this one?
Well, first of all, saying that before Abraham was, I am, is Jesus completely whole stop rejecting the Abrahamic faith, including Moses and everything, is utterly ridiculous. I do believe that there's nuance there, because the term Judaism and some of this is a later development. It's more of this Hebrew way, as we've talked about with Dr. Tabor, that goes back through all the patriarchs and, the stories that were passed down. Jesus is, as we'll discuss more in this podcast, and we've discussed in many others, challenging some of those traditions because a lot of it had been corrupted. But to say that he's completely just throwing the entire thing out, and including that, the 10 Commandments, etc., is, I've never heard anyone say that ever, except he might be the first person I've ever heard say that.
Outside Paul.
That's, yeah.
Paul and John Davis.
Oh yeah, Paul, the ministry of death. Yeah. So anyways, that's a wild claim.
And in his ideology, an Essene being a Judaic sect who was promoting Judaism, he would never have done that, because he himself was anti-religion. He was anti-dogma. And what happens is the New Age ideologies of the Theosophical Society have created new dogma. And one of those dogmas is the diet of vegetarianism. They're saying,
man, he hates the poor Theosophical Society, man. What did they ever do to John Davis, dude?
I also just want to say, he's got such an intricate straw man here that he's formulating, and he's just attacking and bashing it. It's like you've said in the past when we've had our debates, Aaron, and stuff, where it's like John and others have built this little, fake voodoo doll that they're just beating up in the corner. And we're over here like, hey, this isn't even what we're talking about.
We're over here.
We're over here. And they're just, so he's beating up this little straw man that is, Jesus isn't subscribing to Judaism, and that the Essenes were subscribing to Judaism. That's a full inversion and fabrication of what we teach. In fact, Judaism as we know it today is an orthodox version of what was coming out of Judea and the temple cult there. And the Essenes specifically were exiting that system into the wilderness. So they were practicing a Hebrew faith, but a restorative version of it that was, stepping out of the temple cult and everything that I think he's trying to somehow equate to what Jesus is rejecting with before Abraham as I am. So it's almost even hard to follow. It's such an intricate straw man that he's painting here.
Yeah.
Well said. And he's straw manning vegetarianism and acting like the Theosophical Society are the first people in the history of the world to promote vegetarianism as a form of morality or a spiritual path based on kindness and compassion. It all started with Helena Blavatsky. That's absurd. I mean, we know in spiritual traditions across the world have valued kindness and compassion and treating animals fairly, from the Far East to the West. And we have so much evidence of this. It's not controversial. It's a historical fact that this has been an essential part of almost every single spiritual tradition in the history of the world, at least a segment of it.
Yeah, vegetarianism goes back thousands of years to Hinduism. Of course, we know that the Pythagoreans were strict vegetarians, which predates the Jesus movement by about 500 years. And every Jewish Christian sect we know was strict vegetarians, the Essenes vegetarians, Therapeutae vegetarians. Vegetarianism was a widespread spiritual movement in Jesus's day that was shared by many different cultures. I think even many of the Zoroastrians were vegetarians. So it's crazy to say that, this just got made up a couple hundred years ago. The vegetarian tradition of the Nazarenes is widely attested, as we're going to show. And it was a spiritual tenet of theirs, because they believed that the original law of Moses was anti-sacrifice, anti-flesh consumption, per Jeremiah 7:21 and Jeremiah 8:8. And so the Nazarenes were ardent about this, that the original law of Moses has been corrupted by the lying pen of the scribes. And they were trying to preserve it, right? As were all the Essene type of Jewish sects of that day. And so what we believe is that Orthodox Judaism today and in Jesus's day represents an Orthodox corruption of the original covenant of Moses and Abraham, which even Dr. James Tabor and many other scholars show was called the way of Yahweh, the way of the Lord, which is stated over and over again through the Hebrew Bible, which is to do mishpat and tzedakah, justice and righteousness, that's the original covenant of God, the way of the Lord. And it's written by all the prophets as well, and Micah and Amos. This was what the Essene type of Judaism was rejecting orthodoxy for. This is the entire crux of their belief system. And as we're going to show, we have almost too many historical attestations to even show in one presentation. The documentation of this is overwhelming. And that's what makes me, again, surprised that John would be making these claims so definitively. There's no historical proof. This doesn't come from history, when John's about to find out that it most definitely does. So let's continue.
The diet of vegetarianism. They're saying you have to be vegetarian to rise to the next level of whatever this is. Jeshua always spoke of being here today, loving in the now. I leave you one commandment, love one another. He didn't say, I leave you one commandment, love one another, and be a vegetarian. Never said that. Not once do you see that anywhere in any text anywhere, except for in the ideas and the concepts of the Theosophical Society of the early 1900s, and now being re-promoted as truth by people who are making a very good living off of it. Today's teachers still repeat.
It cracks me up. Jesus taught us to love each other, not be vegetarian. The whole reason we're vegetarian is because we don't want to inflict genocide and slavery and murder on innocent animals. So, John, you love cows, but kill them. You love dogs, but you kill them. You don't usually love something that you chop into little pieces and then consume their flesh. Love is about compassion and putting yourself in their shoes and not doing harm and trying to preserve life, not destroy life.
Yeah, the reason we're vegetarians is because Jesus said, love one another. I give you this commandment. And his greatest commandment was, do unto others as you wish others to do unto you. And so last time I checked, none of us want to be murdered against our will and have our flesh eaten. And so we hold the golden rule as the highest standard of the Jesus way. And that's why we are vegetarian, because Jesus said to love one another. And so it's quite a crazy claim to say, Jesus said, love one another. He didn't care about if you kill and murder sentient beings. No, I think he definitely did. And we're going to show you why we think he did.
It's clear he just doesn't, like, he's just never watched anything that we've ever said, I think. And he's just saying whatever he feels in the moment. I guess that fits along with his private vision thing. He had a private vision about what we've said, maybe. I don't know.
For somebody who teaches love nonstop, that's what John's kind of whole thing is, right? I'm the beloved disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved. John was all about love. And so Jesus was just love, 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 love. And then he's like making all these personal attacks and false claims about us. Oh, these guys are just trying to make money. They're making this up. They're hurting people. Like, these are not loving things to say to somebody just because you disagree with their philosophy on something. Sure, tell us where you disagree, but all these ad hominem attacks are not very becoming for John the Beloved, to put it lightly.
And, I just have to say it like it is. John lied about him leaving the summit. He said, I knew as soon as they said that they had these other Essene writings that I couldn't participate in the summit. I'm paraphrasing there, but he said that it was his decision to bow out. When we have the receipts, we uninvited him from the summit. So he's not being truthful here. And it's not very Christ-like to lie about that. And again, we're followers of Yeshua. I have nothing but love in my heart for John. I think he's a nice guy in a lot of ways, and I wish the best for him. But we have to call a spade a spade. He's strawmanning, and he lied several times.
Well, one of the other big red flags that you brought up, James, from your intake call with John that really got our spidey senses tingling is he said he was talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he was talking about another woman he knows who believes that she is the reincarnation of James the Just, the brother of Jesus. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, Aaron. And during our conversation, I asked John if he had any experiences when he was walking amongst the disciples with Jesus, if he had any interactions with James the Just, because we're such big proponents of James on this podcast. And he said he did not. However, there was a woman he knew I'm not sure if she was a client and they did a past life regression or she was just telling the story. But she said that she was James the Just in a past life, and she committed suicide by jumping off a cliff. And John said, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what she told me. So that was kind of a disturbing thing to hear, especially because the murder of James is one of the most historically verified events in all of the first century history.
Yeah, it really raised some red flags because, as you said, James, the death of James the Just, the martyr of James the Just, martyrdom, is one of the most widely attested events in the first century. We've got Josephus writes about it, Hegesippus the Nazarene, Eusebius, I believe Epiphanius, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, all talk about the martyrdom of James under Ananias, the high priest. And so if John was there as John the Beloved, he would definitely have remembered that, especially because we know that James, Peter, and John were the three kind of appointed leaders of the 12. They're mentioned 8 times together in the New Testament, I believe. And so it's, again, just all kinds of red flags. Like, I was John and you were James, but neither of us remember each other. And you committed suicide, even though that's definitely not true. So lots of red flags here. And the fact that John doesn't know about the death of James is another weird one, right? If you were one of the 3 appointed elders of Yeshua and you don't have any memories of James or how he died, and James was called James the Just, he was widely seen as the holiest man after Jesus himself. And so the idea that James would have committed suicide like some, manic depressive person is a really crazy claim, to be honest.
Yeah, it's also interesting that this woman's claim is that he jumped off and committed suicide by jumping down, because those in between the lines attestations from, the Jewish Christian writings, etc., say that James was actually pushed from the perch of the temple and then beat by a fuller's club by Paul. So maybe this is some psychosomatic past life regression demonic force trying to further cover up the fact that maybe this was linked to the Saul persecution of James and the other Christians. I don't know, but it's kind of uncanny that that's the the claim being made.
We haven't even mentioned the fact, guys, that the majority of secular scholars do not believe that John was the beloved disciple from the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John actually makes this pretty obvious. In John chapter 21, it even distinguishes between the sons of Zebedee, John the son of Zebedee, and then the beloved disciple in John chapter 21, 2-7. And there's no reason that it would name John and the beloved disciple, but never say, and John is the beloved disciple. It's clearly the rhetorical goal of John is to distinguish this beloved disciple from the others who are named and leave it kind of open to mystery. And what's interesting, guys, is that I was just doing an interview with Dr. Tabor yesterday, which is coming out next week. And he actually went into this subject all on his own and explained why he doesn't believe that John is the beloved disciple, as most scholars don't, but actually that James is the beloved disciple. So let's take a quick look.
The beloved disciple is not John. So who is it? Well, who would you put if your father has died and you have brothers and you're going to die now? And this is in Judaism. You would say to your brother James, "Mother, behold your son." At that moment, James becomes head of the family and head of the movement. If Jesus puts the care of his mother into the hands of the beloved disciple, slam dunk, that's James.
Yeah.
The earliest reference to it being John is in 180 by Irenaeus. He goes, well, John, the son of Zebedee, leaned on Jesus' breast. So all of a sudden, John is Jesus' intimate. We have no record of anything like that. Also, he gets into the high priest's house. Let's add some more reasons. How could he get into the high priest's house? Peter can't get in. He's a fisherman from the Galilee. But John, a fisherman from the Galilee, can waltz right in, and the door person knows him and goes in the house of Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest. I mean, put this together, please.
Skeptical.
Get real, as we say, get real. It is James all the way. He was allowed to go into the temple. We even have sources that say he went into the Holy of Holies and he wore the priestly mitre.
Doesn't the text of John itself preclude John from being the beloved? Because it names John and it names the beloved disciple as like a different character.
I think it does. The worst transgression, and I think it's a transgression that anyone could ever make, is to turn the beloved disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved, who laid against him at the Last Supper, who whispered to him things that weren't shared with the table. Not Mary Magdalene. I don't agree that it's Mary Magdalene. It's James, the brother of Jesus. And everybody, what? How could you say that? We all know it's John. And I'm going to say, how do you know it's John? Well, it's John. I go, why do you think it's that fisherman, John, son of Zebedee, is the beloved disciple? How did you decide that? Give me the evidence in the New Testament. Let's start with that. Well, why don't we start with two stories of the Zebedee boys? We only have two stories of those boys. One is they want to burn up a village that didn't accept them. And Jesus rebukes them very sharply and says, you don't know what spirit you're of. Wait a minute, what spirit you're of? The second is, Master, I know you don't want to talk about who's great and who's least. And every time we bring it up, you kind of rebuke us. But could we just ask, please? Could we be on the right and left hand when you come to the kingdom? You've chosen 12, but could we be that please? And Jesus, again, you don't know what you're asking. And what he says is, are you ready to suffer the most? And of course, we can do that. And then, of course, a few days later, they run
away. Yeah.
The beloved disciple is not John.
So that's another thing that's problematic for John's claims to be the beloved disciple, who most scholars don't think was John.
Indeed.
So let's keep rocking.
Creating new ideas of dogma and doctrine that are based in theosophical teachings that are proven to be actual fraud is dangerous to the world, because you're literally telling people that this is what Jeshua taught, but it's not what he taught. He did not teach vegetarianism. He did not teach dogmas of diet. He did not teach dogmas of mystical sex, and there is no ancient conspiracy theories to what he taught. He taught to be loving in the now. That is the way. And someone's promoting the idea of the way being that their way is Jeshua's way. If they're saying anything other than being love in the present moment, then they are adding to something that is not spoken of.
Well, what's actually not spoken of is Jesus saying, be love in the present moment. I understand you could maybe derive that philosophical meaning from some of his teachings, like worry not about tomorrow and stuff, but he's quoting as if Jesus really said this in the New Testament, and there are no quotes of this. Maybe the historical Jesus said something like this, but I think there's more to be said in spiritual philosophy than just be love in the present moment. I think elaborating on mystical union and contemplative prayer and meditation on God, like there's lots of other good things to talk about, John, other than just being love in the present moment. Of course, that is the crux of the Jesus way, is love your neighbor as yourself. But to say if you say anything else, you're just adding false words into Jesus's mouth is, again, another straw man attack.
In history. And the idea of Jeshua being mentioned in the Essene writings, there's no evidence of it. None.
So we've never said Jesus was mentioned in the Essene writings, just another straw man.
The idea that he was a vegetarian, there is no documented evidence of it. None. This all comes from the Theosophical Society, from Jekeli and Owsley, not from history. But the real Jeshua taught love and the kingdom within, not dietary dogma. It's hard for these New Age guys to live into, because when you call out the facts, their story falls down, because it's not from historical evidence. It's from an ideology of New Age dogma created in the early 1900s. And what the New Age teachers are teaching nowadays is not the way. It is literally something outside of yourself that you have to incorporate into your life to get to something. That's not what Jeshua taught.
So not murdering innocent beings is doing something outside of yourself you have to incorporate. I don't understand the logic here. How is agreeing to the golden rule standard of nonviolence, non-harm, doing something outside of yourself? That sounds like a pretty strong inward process to me. It sounds like somebody's heart must have to be broken by the realization of what they're contributing to, of suffering and death to God's innocent creatures, to where they do something so contrarian to modern society as giving up flesh consumption, much to the chagrin of meat eaters who love to mock and deride vegans and vegetarians for being weak, just like Paul. And there's many clips I've seen of John just raging on about veganism, vegans being angry, weak people, and this and that, and just going on these tirades, again, strawmanning vegans as these kind of, angry, red-faced, screaming liberals, when that's, maybe some vegans are like that, of course, but that's certainly not the kind of veganism that we teach or practice here on the Jesus way.
And Aaron, he talks about all you have to do is be love in the now. How can you be love in the now and be participating in the murder of innocent beings? It's the opposite of being love in the now. Like, what does that mean? That's such a just empty statement if you don't define
empty platitude.
It's a platitude. Be love in the now, be love in the now. Well, what does that actually look like? It looks like compassion. It looks like patience. It looks like offering understanding. It looks like helping, and it's not inflicting violence. Obviously, that has to be a core component of love. So when he says it's about being love in the now, not vegetarianism, it's a direct contradiction, because it's not vegetarianism. It's just nonviolence. So rephrasing it, it's not about, it's only about love in the now, not nonviolence. Well, love in the now is nonviolence.
Right. Yeah. And again, he's continually choosing, I'll give him very strategic words by hammering Jesus didn't teach a dogma of diet. And we would agree.
Of course.
Jesus didn't teach a dogma of diet at all. Jesus taught love, nonviolence, everything that you just shared, James. But the irony of it all is he keeps also framing it from this theosophical talk, and even in the opening of his video, that everybody's talking about how Jesus was a vegetarian now. I don't know about you guys, but when I pull up the internet, I don't see everyone talking about Jesus being a vegetarian. I don't like, in fact, it doesn't get to go both ways. Most of the time we get hit with the statement, oh, well, you're the only guys talking about this. You're the, because there are so few people actually really discussing this. Thankfully, there are quite a number of them that are reputable scholars that are doing it in that sense, where they have the same type of attestation that we do. But it's weird, because it's like you don't get to have it both ways. He's framing it like the whole world is talking about this, when, to your earlier point, Aaron, actually, you're pretty ragged on if you take this position in the world from the greater world, because most people do have a quote unquote dogma of diet. And that dogma of diet is God created animals for us to eat. It's not what goes into your mouth and what comes out. It's all this dietary stuff. And that has nothing to do with what we're talking about, nor what we believe Jesus was talking about.
Yeah, well said, man. We went into this kicking and screaming, man. This was the most difficult transition for us, James and I at least, when we started seeing all the historical attestations. James, the brother of Jesus and his appointed successor, strict vegetarian from his mother's womb, says Hegesippus. Peter admits to being a vegetarian in Acts 10, which we'll show you. Widespread attestations, all the disciples were vegetarians who abstained from animal flesh. And we saw the Jeremiah-Isaiah thread of the Edenic ideal weaving through it all. And we're like, oh my gosh, look at this lost Christian history of the Nazarenes, the Essene-type of Judaism, of why they were abstaining from flesh consumption. And it broke our egos to smithereens until we had to accept this is the highest way to follow Jesus. Absolute commitment to the golden rule axiom under all circumstances. I will not do harm to any living being. And we know that Jesus saw animals as others, because he said in one sense to the Pharisees, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And if you knew what that meant, you would not have condemned the innocent. And he could only be speaking about the animals in that passage. He's sitting with some prostitutes and tax collectors. And so Christians say, oh, the innocent are the prostitutes and tax collectors he's sitting with. No, he called them, I've not come to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. And Jesus forgave those people of their sins. He wouldn't have said, oh, these guys are all innocent around me. He knew they were sinners. That's why he loved them and came to serve them. The only innocent being in the equation of an animal sacrifice is the animal, not the sinful person getting their sins forgiven, and not the murderous priest who slits the throat of an innocent goat. Jesus was talking about the animals. And in all four Gospels, it shows that he, especially in the Gospel of John, that he opens the cages of the animals to let them free to escape the temple and their coming execution. And then Jesus also says, doesn't your Father, your heavenly Father, take good care of the sparrows, and not one of them falls to the ground without his awareness? How much more will he love you? So right there, Jesus is also saying, God even cares about the sparrows, you guys. If God cares about the sparrows, how much more do you think he cares about you? So there is no question based on the New Testament Gospels that Jesus saw animals as qualifying as others whom God loves and cares for. So it's fine to disagree from a philosophical standpoint, and you can have that argument, but at least acknowledge that we have good reasons for saying what we're saying. We're not just studying the Theosophical Society from 100 years ago and drawing weird New Age conclusions. And so before we get any further into the video reactions, I want to deal with the claim he's made about half a dozen times now that there's no historical proof whatsoever that Jesus was an Essene or vegetarian or any such connections at all. So let's go through some slides to show John some of the proofs we show routinely on this podcast. Because I think the big problem, guys, in John's misunderstanding is that he's kind of clinging to this outdated model that the Essenes were just the Dead Sea Scroll group. It was one sect isolated in Qumran. And we know that that's not true now because, number one, scholars say that the Dead Sea Scroll community area could only have housed about 200 people at any given time. And we know that the Essenes numbered about 4,000 to 5,000 based on our first century sources. So wherever the Essenes lived, it wasn't just in Qumran in one sect. But here's a quote from a legendary scholar, Professor Matthew Black of St. Andrews University, who I think clears up how scholars now have come to see Essenism as a type of Judaism. Because John is right? The Dead Sea Scrolls do not mention the word Essenes anywhere. And scholars are actually very confused where that word comes from because it only shows up in our first century historians using the Greek term. And they're not really sure how this designation began. So scholars have looked into the Dead Sea Scrolls to see what did this community designate themselves? What was their self-designation? So let's read this quote from Professor Matthew Black. Provided we do not define Essenism too narrowly, for instance, by equating it exclusively with the Dead Sea group, but are prepared to understand the term as a general description of this widespread movement of anti-Jerusalem, anti-Pharisaic non-conformity of the period. It is from such Essene type of Judaism that Christianity is descended. So here's a Dead Sea Scroll scholar who's saying he believes that Christianity descended from the Essene type of Judaism. And that's because all of the Essene type of sects became what scholars now call Jewish Christianity. So this movement broke off from Orthodoxy sometime 2 to 3 centuries prior, but evolved very quickly into numerous different sects in the Transjordan region. But here's the thing, guys, is that scholars don't connect groups based on just their names. Sometimes names match, and we can find groups that are similar based on similar names. But for the most part, scholars and historians look at the commonalities between groups because groups usually will split off after they have 1 or 2 disagreements, or just because people from their group travel and they go settle elsewhere. But you have to look, number one, at the commonalities, the common beliefs and practices, and especially, which we're going to show you now, when you get specific beliefs and practices which are unique to 2 different groups that do not connect to any other sect in Jewish history, that is what we call a bullseye in scholarship in terms of connecting groups together. So there's lots of nuance in that we don't believe, and we've never said Jesus was literally some kind of card-carrying Essene who lived in the Qumran caves. That's a very inaccurate way of understanding it, right? Essene type of Judaism was a widespread movement out of which we know that there was 2 sects of Essenism by Jesus's day, the Nazarenes to the north and the Essenes to the south. And Epiphanius explains these 2 types of Judaism, which Josephus also refers to as Josephus says the 2 orders of Essenes, Nazarenes and Essenes. And so Jesus came from the northern branch called the Nazarenes. So let's look at a quote now from Dr. James Tabor, who I think is the best Dead Sea Scroll scholar alive today. James Tabor said, the Dead Sea Scroll community was a baptizing, messianic, apocalyptic group with a teacher of righteousness, 12 council members, and 3 appointed priests. They describe themselves as preparing the way of the Lord in the wilderness. It's from Isaiah. They call themselves the people of the new covenant, which is anti-sacrifice. They see themselves as the temple of God. They forbid divorce. They share everything in common and oppose animal sacrifices. So this is Dr. Tabor's description of the Dead Sea Scroll group based on the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. And if you study New Testament history at all, you notice that every single thing he mentions here is also unique to the Jesus movement, as well as the Essene movement. So here are 11 striking, unique parallels between the Essenes, or Ebionim, as we're going to see, and the Jesus movement. We have atonement baptism, which means they believed you could have your sins forgiven and be purified through repentance and water baptism. So that's unique to the Essenes and the Jesus movement. Here we have, I think, John the Baptist saying this here. Baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. The Pharisees did not practice atonement baptism, nor did the Sadducees or any other Jewish sect of the day. Imminent apocalypticism, meaning they believed the end was very, very imminent, unlike the Pharisees, and definitely unlike the Sadducees. Led by a teacher of righteousness, Jesus is called teacher who has come from God and the righteous one. 12 council members, that's pretty obvious, 12 disciples. 3 appointed priests, that's James, Peter, and John, as we said, mentioned 8 times together in the New Testament, showing that they were Jesus's kind of appointed leaders, right? People of the New Covenant, there's the correlating passages in the New Testament. Forbidding divorce, Jesus forbids divorce in Luke 16. Voluntary poverty, we're going to go over this one in big detail soon. Opposing animal sacrifices, rejecting orthodox liturgical laws or practices, and favoriting 2 specific prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah. Jesus refers to Isaiah dozens of times in the New Testament and refers to Jeremiah 6 different times, and is even described as being the reincarnation of Jeremiah by his disciples. So John says there's absolutely no historical evidence, and yet we have 11 striking, unique pieces of historical evidence here, directly connecting only these 2 sects. So you can't mismatch these with any other Jewish sect, and that bears repeating. And then we have the work of Dr. Robert Eisenman and Michael Wise. They are Dead Sea Scroll scholars as well, who said that the description of the Ebionites is crucial to our understanding of these texts and the widespread use of the term Ebion or Ebionim, meaning the poor ones in Qumran. These Ebionim held the memory of James, the brother of Jesus, in the highest regard, while Paul they regarded as the enemy or Antichrist. The use of the term Ebionim as a self-designation at Qumran is widespread, most notably in the Pesharim. So here is the actual designation from the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is from 4Q171, the congregation of the Ebionim, or the poor ones. So that, to scholars and historians and linguists, shows a pretty clear self-designation. Here's another example of the Ebionim appearing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He has saved the soul of the Ebion, the poor one. And for you will deliver into the hands of the poor ones, which is how they saw themselves, the enemies of all the countries. So their eschatology was that they believed that the angels of God would descend from heaven and destroy the Kittim or the Romans and establish them, the poor ones, the Ebionim, above all the nations. So here is a direct prophecy attributing to themselves as the Ebionim, their self-designation. And then we have the religious dictionary of history and doctrinal practice theology, which says that the term Ebionim or Ebionites, that's Ebionites is the English rendering of the Hebrew name Ebionim, says this designation was at first like Nazarenes, a common name for all Christians, per Epiphanius. So here's some attestations from early church fathers. They were called Ebionites or Ebionim by the ancients. Sounds a lot like the Dead Sea Scroll group. Those who were called the Ebionites used the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew only, etc., etc. And here's a quote from Ambrosiaster saying that they believed that the Apostle Paul taught something different than what Jesus taught, just as Dr. Robert Eisenman said. And then here's another amazing attestation from Jerome in his commentary on Galatians, when Paul says that James asked Paul to remember the poor and to send gifts economically, financial gifts to the poor ones in Jerusalem. So Jerome interprets this as meaning the Ebionim, the poor ones. Here's the actual quote. The holy poor are the Jewish believers. And he talks about how they need to lay offerings to the Ebionim because that was the qualification for being part of the group. You had to donate all you possessed to the group, the poor ones, which we see Jesus saying when he's inviting people in the New Testament to be his disciple. He says, if you want to follow me, come and sell all you possess to the Ebion, the poor, and then you can come follow me. This, as we see in Acts and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, was the requirement to enter the group. You had to commit to their practice of voluntary poverty. And that's what Jerome is saying here as well. So an amazing attestation there from the 4th century. And then we have more from Epiphanius. They, the Ebionim or Ebionites, do not accept Moses' Pentateuch in its entirety, but reject certain sayings, and they assert that certain passages have been interpolated by the scribes, falsifying the law and making additions. So they believe that the law had been altered, right, by the lying pen of the scribes, Jeremiah 8:8. The Clementine writings say the same thing. I won't read that. But this is one of the common beliefs of the Essene groups, right, is that they believe the Torah was corrupted. Now, this is from the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, which we believe is the oldest written gospel account of Yeshua of all. And in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, we have a few surviving quotes, one of which is Jesus directly saying, I have come to abolish the sacrifices. And if you cease not from sacrificing, the wrath of God will not cease from you. And then in another quote from the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, he says, I have not desired to eat flesh in this Passover with you. And this is the Passover section of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. So the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew is attested by over a dozen church fathers, right, guys, as being the actual gospel account written by Matthew himself in the Hebrew dialect for the sake of the Jewish Christians. This is what Papias said as early as 80 AD, that Matthew was the first one to write a gospel. And so many scholars who study it, such as Dr. James Edwards, date it between as early as maybe 33 AD, all the way through about 50 AD, if you believe the attestations. And so what do you mean there's no historical evidence? The oldest potential source we have of Jesus has him directly saying, I will not eat flesh with you at Passover. And in one of John's videos, guys, he actually says, Jesus ate lamb at Passover, which is ironically something Christian apologists often say, to which we respond, please show me the verse where Jesus eats lamb, because it is nowhere in the New Testament. In fact, famously, Jesus doesn't eat lamb at Passover. He eats unleavened bread and breaks the bread, as it's written in the Essene documents in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. Eat the bread and the wine only. And Jesus said, this bread is my flesh, this wine is my blood. So we've got a lot of problems already here with some of the things John has been claiming. So here we have some attestations about Jesus being from the Nazarene sect, which again predated Jeshua himself. Epiphanius from the Panarian says the Nazarene sect was before Christ, and also says this group did not name themselves after Christ or with Jesus' own name, but Nazarene. All Christians were called Nazarenes once. Everyone called the Christians Nazarenes, as I said before. And then from Josephus says the Essenes show more love for each other than do any other sect. So if Jesus was from any sect or emerged out of any sect of Judaism, don't you think it might be the one who showed more love for each other than any other sect? Here is a bunch of attestations from the book of Acts of the Nazarenes, who are also called followers of the way. We have a ton of verses about the way, which they call a sect. So it's not a name of a town Jesus is from. It is explicitly said to be the sect of the Nazarenes in Acts 24. So even the Bible attests to this. Now let's zero in a bit. Let's look at the attestations, the overwhelming attestations of these 5 commonalities or parallels between the Jesus movement and the Essene Ebionim. Number 1, baptism. Here's a quote from Philo saying that they do not bring sacrifices of animals, but they wash themselves in cold water constantly to preserve their purity. Epiphanius also says they have something of a baptismal rite. Baptism was a purification rite as found in the law of Moses. And in the New Testament, as we already showed you, baptism for the forgiveness of sins, etc., all through the New Testament. Repent and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, just like the Essenes. Then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, who explicitly detail their atonement baptism practice. From the community rule, they shall be cleansed from all their sins by the waters of cleansing. And a baptismal liturgy from 4Q 414. He established for himself a statute of atonement for the forgiveness of sins. To do what? To walk in righteous purity. He shall bathe in water and sprinkle upon his garments or body. They shall then return from the water sanctified, cleansing his people through the waters of purification. So this is why we have problems when people claim there's no connection to Jesus and the Essenes, when John the Baptist came preaching literally straight out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And Jesus preached and practiced the very same thing, as did all the first Christians. Then we have more attestations from the early Nazarene Acts, the Clementine writings, about baptism for the forgiveness of sins. You guys can screenshot that if you want.
Also, just to further steelman this connection with baptism between the Essene and specifically the Nazarene group, Aaron, in the Panarion, where Epiphanius writes about the Nazarenes as a particular Jewish sect, remember when he's dialing in and discussing the heresies of Judaism, he never mentions the word Essene. He mentions the Essenes, the Nazarenes, and the Hemero-Baptists are another sect of Judaism. And the Hemero-Baptists in his writings precede the Nazarenes. And he says in his section on the Nazarenes that they are like the Hemero-Baptists. And what does he say about the Hemero-Baptists? just before the Nazarene section, he says that they wash themselves daily, counting it as righteousness, and they do not sacrifice animals. Then he goes on to talk about the Nazarenes and say they're like the Himera Baptists, and they specifically focus on the non-sacrificial element as being unlawful. So there's a connection right there, even from a church father, that that's showing that this baptismal element is what's connecting these groups specifically, along with that being a replacement for animal sacrifice.
That's the crazy thing about this subject, man, is there's actually so many different attestations. It's kind of hard to keep track of. We have a Notion doc where we try to keep all these historical attestations. That's like, you just have to scroll for hours to get through it all the different documentation, scholarly connections, historians. It's like, it's not even debatable that the early Christians were vegetarian. Like, I don't even think any scholar debates that. It's just that, was Jesus a vegetarian? If all the Nazarenes was Jesus? And we think yes, because even his blood brother James was a vegetarian, and his other brothers Simeon and Jude as well. And so why would Jesus be the only non-vegetarian in his family, right? So this is the second commonality, communal living or voluntary poverty. So Philo of Alexandria, first century historian, talking about the Essenes. They alone of almost all men have become poor and destitute by deliberate action. None of them possesses a house or slaves or land. All property is shared in common. From Josephus, it is a law among them that those who come to them must let what they have be in common to the whole order. Hippolytus, I believe a 2nd or 3rd century historian, also documents they possess nothing of their own, but there is a single fund for all, forming one household. Any individual coming forward to join the sect must sell his possessions and present the price of them to the community. This is exactly what Jesus tells people to do in the New Testament. If you want to join our movement and be my disciple, sell all you possess to the Ebionim. Josephus, another quote here from Jewish Wars, equality of possession. So this is a widespread fact about the Essenes, is that they lived in this kind of voluntary poverty and communal living where they shared everything in common. Here it is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now this is from the community rule. This is the liturgical document of the Essenes. They shall relinquish all their possessions by means of the order and join the property of the community. None shall say that anything is his own, nor shall anyone refuse the use of his property to the community. And again from the community rule, when one enters the covenant to live according to all these precepts, he shall bring his knowledge, his strength, and his possessions into the community of God. So I want you guys to see here these words I've highlighted. Look at these striking, almost word-for-word parallels in the book of Acts here. Acts 2:44. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Acts 4. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own. That's almost word for word. And they shared everything they had. There was no needy persons among them, and they distributed to anyone who had need. So how can you say there are no connections when we have an almost word for word connection about this unique type of living that, again, is unique only to the Essene type of Judaism and the Jesus movement?
One of the first sources you mentioned also included that they reject slavery. And I think that's such an important point because all of the other Jewish and Greek groups, Roman groups of that time, slavery was commonplace. So this was actually a revolutionary action to reject slavery that really, to me, is an indication of this moral philosophy of compassion to all people, to all beings. And it very strongly links the Essenes, the Nazarenes, the early Christians, and the teachings of Jesus.
So now we get into the anti-sacrifice. We know that the community rule documents this in pretty good detail. Atonement shall be made for the guilty rebellion and for sin without the flesh of burnt offerings and the fat of sacrifice. So that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then Eusebius says, this is from Proof of Gospel 3.3. Jesus has not ordained that God should be honored with the sacrifices of bulls or the slaughter of unreasoning beasts, or by blood or fire, or the incense made of earthly things. He thought these things low and earthly and quite unworthy of the immortal nature of God, and judged the most acceptable and sweetest sacrifice of God to be the keeping of his own commandments. So this is Eusebius, who probably has all kinds of Nazarene works and commentaries he's getting this from, is saying that Jesus specifically rejected animal sacrifice for all of these reasons, and that keeping God's commandments was what we should do, which means he obviously didn't reject the entire Abrahamic faith, right? We have Origen, we have the Epistle of Barnabas, we have Arnobius, all attesting that the Essenes, the Nazarenes, all the Jewish Christian Essene type of groups rejected animal sacrifice. Origen even says the blood of sacrifices was not required by the Most High, as the Essenes believed. Jesus came to do away with these sacrifices, as Jesus explicitly says in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, as we just read. I have come to abolish the sacrifices. The Epistle of Barnabas, first century document, you guys. He, meaning Jesus, abolished the sacrifices, lest you should place your trust in them. So, whole lot of attestations here, right? And then even our first century historians, Philo, say the Essenes do not sacrifice animals. And look at this from Proof of Gospel 3.5. They, speaking of the 12 disciples, embraced and persevered in a laborious and strenuous life, with fasting and abstinence from wine and meat. So the 12 disciples abstained from wine and meat, says Eusebius in the 4th century. And then, of course, we have Jesus' own attestations against animal sacrifice. Matthew 12:7, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, which I read earlier. Mark 12:33. This is the only time in Mark, as Dr. Tabor points out, that Jesus ever tells somebody that they understood his gospel message correctly. This person says to Jesus after he cleanses the temple, to love God with all your heart and all your understanding, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw he had answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. So Jesus thinks the kingdom of God has a lot to do with not killing and sacrificing animals. Pretty amazing. And then again, there's the quote from the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. What most people don't know, which you pointed out, Cam, in your documentary Christspiracy, is that the Hebrew word in the book of Jeremiah for you've made my father's house a den of thieves or robbers, the Hebrew word in Jeremiah is paritz, which means murderers or shredders of flesh, violent one. So here it is in the Strong's Concordance, paritz, which should be translated, you've made my father's house a den of murderers. So it seems like Jesus had some problems with the animal murder going on in the temple. More attestations from church fathers. The Ebionim, which we know is the Dead Sea Scroll group from ancient times, declare that the sacrifices were instituted neither by God nor in accordance with his will. Philo of Alexandria, they do not sacrifice animals. Clementine recognitions, God did not desire sacrifices, but desired the heart to be cleansed. Okay, so here's the quote we're zeroing in on. Now we get into the connection of vegetarianism, which is specifically what I think John has the most problem with. So John says right off the bat, guys, there's no evidence that the Essenes were vegetarians anywhere. Well, the problem with that is that in the Jewish War, chapter 2, Josephus says, speaking of the Essenes, their food consists of loaves of bread, a dish of vegetables with a condiment of salt, and their drink is water. No meat or flesh mentioned. And then in the Acts of Thomas, which is dated to the 2nd or early 3rd century, Thomas is described as a prototypical Essene, continually fasting and praying, abstaining from eating of flesh, eats only bread with salt and drinks only water, as Josephus said, wears the same garment, gives whatever he has to others. So although Christians see these books, Gnostic books or Apocrypha like Acts of Thomas as forgeries and all this stuff, scholars and historians don't care about those dichotomies. They just want to read attestations. What are the earliest writings we have from any Christian groups at all? We're going to study those and cross-compare them to see the evidence. And in a very early writing, we have Thomas, one of the 12, being described as a prototypical Essene, point for point. Pretty interesting. St. Jerome, the consumption of animal flesh was unknown up to the Great Flood. Jesus Christ, who appeared when the time was fulfilled, again joined the end to the beginning, so that we are now no longer allowed to eat flesh. So even one of the early church fathers who wrote the Latin Vulgate himself, who transcribed the Latin Vulgate, says that Jesus abolished sacrifices, joining the end to the beginning, so we're not allowed to eat flesh anymore. That's a pretty early attestation of Jesus being a vegetarian. He also says in his commentary in Isaiah, the Nazarenes abstained from eating animal food and from the flesh of living beings. Eusebius from Proof of Gospel, we read that already. Then we have Clement of Alexandria describing the apostle Matthew. Matthew partook of seeds and nuts, hard-shelled fruits and vegetables, without flesh. Wow. So even Matthew was a vegetarian. Epiphanius, they, the Ebionim, abstained from meat. Hegesippus says, James the Just was holy from his mother's womb. He drank no wine or strong drink, nor did he eat meat. Now, of all the connections of Jesus probably being a vegetarian, that's got to be the strongest one, right? His blood brother, who he appointed as his successor, he must have thought pretty highly of, right, was a vegetarian. So do you think they grew up in the same household, but one was a vegetarian and one was a meat eater? I find that highly unlikely to be possible. And then we have Peter actually confessing in the book of Acts, whether this is historical or not, who knows? But he sees a large sheet come down in this vision, right? And it says, in it were all kinds of four-footed creatures. So cows, lambs, and goats definitely belong in that category, right? The voice says, get up, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, by no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean. So this harkens back to how the Essene type of Judaism saw all animals as being unclean, not just pigs, as it is in the Torah. Now, I'll let you comment on this one, Cam, because this is something you pulled out for me a couple of years ago, I think. In the Syriac Aramaic, or the Peshitta, there is a different translation of this quote from Luke 21:34. Do you want to read that?
Yeah. So actually, this is from what's called the Evangelion de Damafresh or something. I think it's hard to speak because it's Aramaic, but essentially there's this gospel preserved, and you can Google this, take a screenshot, you can pull up the text itself, look at the Aramaic right next to the English on like archive.org or Google Books, and you'll see that this attestation, Luke 21:34, whereas in our modern Greek gospels, the way that it lays out is Jesus is saying he's hastening a warning against dissipation and drunkenness, etc. But here we see in the Aramaic version, which our good friend Chris Sartain actually has a really good video, just to save time, we won't go into all the details, showing how this preserves what looks to be a much earlier Greek. So the text looks like it's pointing to an earlier tradition all the way back to the second, maybe even verging into the first century. But what it says is, instead of dissipation, it's a warning against eating flesh, eating meat, and drunkenness from wine, and the anxiety of the world. And this earlier, it seems to be attestation, makes so much more sense of that verse in Luke.
Specialists who specialize in Syriac Aramaic, who study this, many of them believe, as you said, that this preserves an older translation of the Greek. And we know that our manuscript tradition has about, 200 years basically missing before our first manuscript fragments start to appear. So we don't know what the first Greek Gospels looked like in 50, 70, 90 AD and so forth. But due to one of the most important criterions in textual criticism, called the criterion of embarrassment, this passage checks out as likely being an earlier edition, not a later edition, because scribes don't put in things that are embarrassing later, right? They try to take out things that are embarrassing, and to have Jesus saying, do not eat flesh or drink wine, is definitely embarrassing to later Catholic Orthodoxy, who eats flesh and drinks wine, right? So that's another reason why many scholars think this passage is probably original to the Greek Gospels. And then another one of our biggest points of evidence is actually Paul himself, who has a lot of problems with the Jerusalem Christians, the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem under James, and complains about them a lot. And one of his chief complaints is that they're vegetarians. And he says quite a bit about this. And he calls them weak because they eat only vegetables. So that's a really early attestation in the 50s CE, that the Nazarene Christians under James in Jerusalem, who were the followers of Jesus when he lived, right, ate only vegetables. Then in Acts 15, another attestation. Paul kind of stands trial before James, and he gives Paul 4 strict criteria for the Gentiles to follow, which is to abstain from anything offered to idols, anything sacrificed to idols, from fornication, from whatever's been strangled, and from whatever has blood in it. So that's a very kind way of James saying, don't eat flesh, because all flesh, no matter how you prepare it, always has blood still inside of it. It's impossible to get all of the blood out of flesh. And so if it's against the covenants to consume blood, then you wouldn't want to consume meat for that very reason. So that's another early attestation from the Bible itself. We have Porphyry in the 3rd century saying, "But the Essenes, who are a sect of the Jews, abstain from all animal food, and they are accustomed to nourish themselves on milk and cheese and vegetables." So again, John says there's no proof anywhere that the Essenes were vegetarians. And here's what our third direct claim from early historians, that the Essenes abstained from animal flesh. Then we have Epiphanius. And so they, talking about the Nazarene Essenes, were Jews who kept all the Jewish observances, but they would not offer sacrifice or eat flesh. In their eyes, it was unlawful to eat flesh or to sacrifice. So I think we've beat that horse to death already. But just to give you guys a snippet here of how much attestation there is for this, we're not just New Age apologists making this stuff up. We do diligent research and have done diligent research for years to pull out all these attestations. Because guys, as you know, it's not a quick task to read through all these long patristic works to find these quotes, right? Thank goodness for ChatGPT helping us out a little bit. But this has been painstaking, laborious research for us. And we're happy to show the receipts that we brought for this.
Also, just one little Nazarene upgrade to that famous saying, rather than "we're not beating a dead horse anymore, we're not going to feed this fed horse anymore."
There we
Right.
go.
Well, speaking of feeding animals, this is another really cool piece of evidence from archaeological evidence. I'll just read it here. At a known Essene settlement near Ein Gedi, southern Israel, archaeologists found 28 small dwellings, a ritual bath or mikvah, pottery and coins, but a complete absence of animal bones, despite thorough sifting of soil. In contrast, the nearby Ein Gedi village yielded over 4,000 animal bones, indicating non-vegetarian practices there. Excavator Yitzhak Hirschfield concluded this suggests the site's settlers may have been vegetarian, aligning with ancient descriptions of Essene asceticism. So this is one of the other nuances of the Dead Sea Scroll group, right? Is that we know that the scrolls in Qumran are not just from one sect, but they come from a number of sects, at least 2, maybe 3. Maybe some even come from the temple, as Jews were trying to preserve their texts from Rome in 70 AD, when Rome came to destroy Judaism in Jerusalem. So it's a conglomeration of different groups and texts, sectarian texts. And some of the groups we know did offer sacrifices based on archaeological evidence. And probably those were the Zadokite priests that came later. But the Essenes were another sect that stayed there and stashed their scrolls there. And we have great evidence, even archaeologically, that they did not have animal sacrifice. And so that brings us to the final commonality, rejection of orthodoxy. So this is a quote from the Damascus document, which is from the Essene sectarian group. This is them talking about the temple priests, okay? They say, "They have defiled the temple, and they have not kept themselves from forbidden things according to the commandments. They have lied concerning the judgments of righteousness and have despised the covenant of God." So this quote absolutely nukes any such claim that the Essenes were just like the Orthodox Jews of the day, practicing radical Torah observance. Absolutely not. Look at these claims they're making about the temple priests, that they've defiled the temple. How? Probably with animal sacrifice, which they rejected. They said that these priests have not kept themselves to the commandments of God. They have lied about the judgments of God, and they have despised God's covenant. What covenant is that? The way of Yahweh in the Old Testament, to do mitzpat and tzedakah. Then we have an amazing quote from Jesus in Mark 7, verse 8, the oldest gospel. Isaiah, the Proto-Essene prophet, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition." What else could Jesus be talking about here by saying you abandon the commandments of God and hold to human tradition, when these temple priests, what do you mean, Jesus? They're practicing all the 613 Levitical laws. What do you mean they're rejecting the commandments of God for human tradition? This is clear proof, right, that Jesus believed that these purity laws that the Orthodox priests were practicing were human traditions, just like the Essenes believed. Pretty interesting, right?
Totally. And I think this is one of the things that creates one of the big confusions that leads to 2 separate straw men that are often hurled at this conversation, which is there are people that come from the camp that Jesus fully rejected the law has nothing to do with it. And it becomes in the realm of this, you know, more like Pauline theology. And then there's the uber, you know, committed like Hebrew roots, etc., that believe that Jesus fulfilled and kept and upholds the entirety of all the 613 laws. And it's neither of those. It's that he rejected the man-made laws, but fulfilled and upheld the true one law from God, which is the 10 Commandments, which is summed up in love God and love others. But a specification there is that the animal sacrificial ritual was the most abhorrent, grotesque, abominable violation of that law that was being committed with impunity at that time.
Yeah.
So that is why it became the forefront of the message of the Nazarenes and the deviation of their sect, as attested to by Epiphanius, because this act in and of itself is a direct violation. So it's neither of those straw men, you know. It's that Jesus upheld God's true law and rejected all these laws that break it, mainly animal sacrificial ritual.
Right. Yeah, really good point. Then here, you guys can screenshot this if you want. This is just a table showing all the commonalities of the Jewish Christian beliefs that Jesus shared. And then here's a big point you pulled out, Cam. Jesus in the Gospel of John, so John's Gospel, is written to have been crucified underneath the sign that says, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews, which is obviously a condemnation of his sect, the Nazarenes, right? This was the way Rome did things, is they would put these signs above crucified victims to show this is what group this person was from, a Samaritan or whatever. And this is what happens when you oppose us, Nazarenes. It would be a warning to people following this kind of philosophy of the Nazarenes. And so why would Jesus be crucified underneath this sign if it was just about, oh, here's a guy from a town called Nazareth? Nobody cares what town somebody's from when they're being crucified. They want to know why they got crucified. And it seems like in John, Jesus is being indicted as being crucified because he was Nazarene, at least in part, right?
Exactly. And it's ironic it comes from John's gospel, which it's really clear not only from the Gospel of John. I think it's, you know, almost all the attestations across all the Gospels refer to Jesus as the Nazarene or the Nazarene. And both of the Greek forms of that word complicate any derivation from Nazareth, especially the additional vowel in Nazarene, which points only to a sectarian title. And there's these anomalies, you know, like he will be called a Nazarene, this prophecy that's in the Gospel of Matthew, which is problematic for scholars for centuries because they're like, wait a minute, there's no Old Testament, you know, prophecy or anything we've ever seen that he will be called a Nazarene. But now they know that this is alluding to that Isaiah prophecy in Isaiah 11, that a Notzrim, a Nazarene, shall come from the branch of Jesse and restore this kingdom of heaven on earth. And that's where I think that second half of the condemnation is coming from, the King of the Jews, because he was talking so much of this kingdom of heaven on earth, which was defined in the messianic prophecy of Isaiah as complete harmony between humans and animals on earth, that this is the kingdom he was professing. And so they're crucifying him facing the temple, by the way. If you look at any of the paintings of Jesus being crucified, they're almost always depicted with him facing the temple so that he can see, hey, buddy, you thought you could overthrow the kingdom of Rome and this blood cult system, but we're going to crucify you right in front of it and mock your claims, you know?
Yeah. Amazing point, man. There's so much lost history here, guys. It's why we love this. It's why it's so fun to dive into the historicity, because you never stop uncovering these kinds of historical gems. So we definitely know there are some good reasons for thinking Jesus was a vegetarian and emerged out of this Essene type of Judaism. And so we'll go ahead and continue the video here and finish out some of John's claims.
Think not upon tomorrow, be here today. You're not seeking enlightenment, you become the enlightenment. And the enlightenment does not have a dogma. It's just love. It's just the energy of love. This idea that he was an Essene and a vegetarian does not come from history. It doesn't come from any of my regretments either.
Well, that's what matters most, right?
I'm sorry, but after just going through that slideshow, there's just so many levels of humor to that.
Some good humble pie for sure.
These people have read Dolores Cannon's book, and it has no presence in truth.
Wait, he just said he just said there we read all this from Dolores Cannon's books.
All of those proofs were straight out of Dolores Cannon's book.
Yeah. He's just throwing stuff at the wall, man, hoping it sticks. Theosophicals, Edmund Bordeaux, Dolores Cannon. No, it's actually Josephus, Philo, Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah.
When you look at this, there's a lot in this that's interesting, because if you read the Bible, you'll very quickly understand that Jeshua never claimed to be the Messiah.
Jeshua never claimed to be the Messiah.
Well,
okay. We got some big problems here again.
Well, the word Messiah means Meshiach, which means king or ruler. It had nothing to do with spirituality in the time. That's a later addition to the construct of the word Messiah. Meshiach literally meant a ruling king that would come in to save his people or her people, his people at the time.
Yikes. Okay, let me pull this up.
Meshiach.
Be nice.
Isn't that the brother of Shadrach and Meshach or something?
Jeshua the Meshiach.
Yeshua ben Meshiach. Okay, so here's the quote we're zeroing in on. This is a word-for-word quote. If you read the Bible, you'll very quickly understand that Jeshua never claimed to be the Messiah. This comes from Paul, not Jeshua. The word Messiah means Meshiach, which means king or ruler. It had nothing to do with spirituality at the time. That's a later addition to the construct of the word Messiah. Meshiach literally means a ruling king that would come in to save the people. So let's clear a few things up. The word is not Meshiach, it's Mashiach, and Mashiach does not mean king or ruler. It sounds like John might be confusing the word Mashiach with a similar Hebrew word, Melech, which is the word for king or ruler. Mashiach is a different root word in Hebrew, which literally means anointed one. So the root word for king is spelled Mem Lamed Kaf, or Melech, and the root word for Messiah is spelled Mem Shin Yod Chet, Mashiach. So it's a completely different root word. A Mashiach could be a king or a ruler. It could be, if they were anointed by a priest, but the typical definition of Mashiach is a prophet or a priest or anyone that's sent or anointed by God. So it's just kind of a catch-all term for someone who's appointed by God to help or save or heal. But the first true Mashiach, as we know in the Bible, was Moses' brother Aaron, whose lineage became the priestly line of Judaism, the Levites. The Levites were not kings or rulers, yet they were called the anointed ones, right? And then next we have the claim that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah in the New Testament. I struggle to comprehend how somebody could make a statement like this, because for crying out loud, in all four Gospels, Jesus directly claims that he is the Messiah or agrees with people who call him the Messiah. This is actually one of the historical facts about Yeshua that scholars in the Jesus Seminar agreed is a very accurate depiction of the historical Jesus. There are actually 7 direct messianic claims in the Gospels, and we're just going to look at a couple of them so as, again, not to beat the dead horse.
Yeshua's messianic claims. Mark 14, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? And Jesus answers, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.
And that's actually kind of a double messianic claim, because the quote that he's referring to there, the Son of Man, you will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, that's a direct reference to Daniel 7, the famous messianic prophecy. And so Jesus he says, I am, and you will see me fulfilling the messianic prophecy of Daniel 7 is essentially what he's saying there.
Next, we have John 4:25. I know the Messiah is coming. And Jesus says to her, I am he, the one who is speaking to you. Next, we have John 10. How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. And Jesus answered, I have told you, and you do not believe. But the works that I do in my Father's name testify to me.
So there Jesus is saying, I've already told you I'm the Messiah, but you don't believe me. And then he says, the works that I do in my Father's name testify that I'm the Messiah. A double claim again.
Another slam dunk there. We have Matthew 16 next. Who do you say that I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. Doesn't get more clear than that, Aaron.
Yeah. I'm no psychiatrist, but these sound like some pretty definite claims to me. And notice how it doesn't say here, when Simon Peter answers, "You are the Messiah." It doesn't say, and then Jeshua answered him, "No, I'm not. I don't believe in messiahs. Just be here now."
Eat meat and be here now and love.
Eat meat and be here now. So, I mean, we only looked at 4 out of the 7 messianic claims there. And already we see there is no question Yeshua claimed to be the Messiah in the Gospels. And just a cursory reading of the Gospels would show someone this. So again, I have to question if John has even ever read the Gospels, if he could make a claim like that. Or do you just pull out snippets and quotes, when you need to use them? This is why doing your due diligence is important before you make these big claims. So shouldn't we be cautious about spreading false information about Yeshua if we claim to be his disciples, right? I mean, this is like vacation Bible school stuff, guys. I would have been, if you had asked me when I was 8 years old in Sunday school, "Aaron, did Jesus ever claim to be the Messiah?" I would have been able to quote one of those passages for you. So again, I would have no problem if John had said, "I know that Jesus is recorded as claiming to be the Messiah in the Gospels, but in my private visions, he never did. He just told us to be here now." Okay, fair. You're entitled to have that opinion. But when you're presenting yourself as an expert on Jesus, saying, "I know based on my private memories, Jesus never said this, and it's not even in the Bible either," you're leading people to believe in a false image of Jesus, which is exactly what religion has done for 2,000 years. And since John criticizes religion, rightly so, I wouldn't think he'd want to be guilty of the same crime, right? But then again, perhaps John is technically correct in saying that Jeshua never claimed to be the Messiah because there is no Jeshua in the Bible.
When I spoke with him, I asked him some specific questions, and he has an interesting strategy of he'll talk about his memories if it supports his argument, but when asked about specific events, he just will usually say that he doesn't remember that. So it's kind of a convenient way. Maybe he's telling the truth, but it's very convenient that you can't back him into a corner or kind of cross-reference or verify his claims, because if you ask about any historical event that he's not aware of, he can just say he doesn't remember that.
Hard to be epistemically consistent with that approach. Let's look at the next claim here.
They were a disciplined community who were teaching Judaism. Why do we know that? Because the only documented writings that are attributed to the Essenes, and I say attributed because it's not proven that there are Essene writings, it's the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were only about the Torah. They were 100% based in the Torah.
Okay, so let's pause. This is the statement we're zeroing in on here. John says, they were a disciplined community that was teaching Judaism. The Dead Sea Scrolls were only about the Torah. The Essenes were extreme followers of the laws of Judaism. We know that's not true. Yet Jeshua continually broke the law all through the Bible. So for him to be an Essene is almost impossible to believe. Okay, so this is one of those statements, guys, that you hear, and right away you know that this person's just sort of going off popular opinions that they've heard people say. Because if you actually read Josephus, Philo, and Pliny's writings on the Essenes, you would never try to argue that the Essenes followed the same Jewish law as the Pharisees and Sadducees. The fact that they didn't is one of the most well-known facts about them. They were a highly pacifistic, anti-temple, anti-Pharisaic movement that purposefully withdrew to the Transjordan to get away from the wicked priests, as they called them, of the Jerusalem temple. And even John continually admits that the Essenes were an isolationist group that separated themselves. And so it should be obvious, right, that groups don't split off from each other when they have all the same beliefs. The Essenes had significant differences with the temple cult and repudiated their laws and practices, as we saw in the Damascus document. So this argument that John thinks works in his favor, that Yeshua continually broke Jewish law, is actually an argument against his case and evidence for ours. We often cite this fact, that Yeshua rejected many of the purity laws of Judaism, as one of his striking commonalities with the Essenes, as we showed you. It's clear from all our earliest sources that Yeshua and the Essene-type Judaism saw the Torah as being the 10 Commandments. Yeshua's answer when he was asked how to be saved was keep the commandments, and he would list them. But again, John tries to paint Jesus as this law-breaking hippie who rejected all facets of Judaism, which is about as false of a claim as one can make about the historical Jesus. So this is yet another striking parallel that Jesus shares with the Essenes. So when Josephus says that they were purer than the other sects, he doesn't mean they were more anal about following the 600 liturgical laws. There's no evidence of that. The sense in which they were purer is that they abstained from all the, gorging and gluttony of Jewish festivals. They abstained from alcohol. They did water baptism twice a day. They fasted much longer and more often than Orthodox Jews. And that's the sense that they were purer than the other Jews. So there is no evidence in the Dead Sea Scrolls or any historical attestations that the Essenes kept the same 613 Levitical laws as written in the Torah. And then the last part of his claim was that the Dead Sea Scrolls are only about the Torah. And this is also provably false. There are dozens of sectarian documents in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of them are copies of the Torah, for sure, books of the Torah. But a lot of them are commentaries on the prophets and liturgical documents and their own Thanksgiving hymns and so forth. And that's studying those sectarian documents is how scholars are connecting the Ebionim Essenes to the Jesus movement. So it's also not true to say that the Dead Sea Scrolls are just about the Torah.
Began seeking. Right? Jeshua didn't ask you to seek. He asked you to be in the present, be now.
So he says, Yeshua did not ask you to seek. But Matthew 7:7, Jesus says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. And then in the Gospel of Thomas, which he quotes often, right? I think it's the second or third saying, so he should be familiar with it. Jesus says, let the one who seeks not stop seeking until they find. And when they find, they'll be astonished, etc. So again, this is the problem, right?
What about Matthew 6:33? Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness.
Oh, there it is again.
So the first thing you should do is seek. It's not like something you do sometimes. It's literally before you do anything else, seek.
And then don't stop seeking until you find. So again, it's okay that people get details wrong. We're not faulting John for that. But again, you're painting a false Jesus when you say Jesus didn't want you to seek. Well, what if he did, John? What if a big part of Jesus's gospel was seek the kingdom of God? Keep the commandments, right? If you love me, obey my commandments. Seeking God, seeking righteousness was what Jesus told his disciples to do. And that was a big part of his ministry. So let's be very careful, right? Adding words to his mouth and subtracting words from his mouth that are not accurate to history.
I also just have to cut to the heart of this one in that, it is also convenient to reject seeking as a part of Jesus's message in as such that it's connected to that verse you just gave, James, because seek first the kingdom of God. Well, if you seek first the kingdom of God, it's not going to be very long before you figure out that the kingdom of God is the vision of Isaiah and these, principles about doing unto others, including animals, which eventually leads to what you consume. And I think that we might see a problem with John in that he doesn't want to accept that reality. Maybe that's the deep thing. So let's just throw out seeking as well, so we don't have to face that truth.
Exactly.
Yeah, great point. And we saw in Mark that Jesus says to the man who says, oh, loving your neighbor as yourself and loving God is better than all these sacrifices. And Jesus says, you are not far from the kingdom of God. So another equivalency, right? That Jesus saw the kingdom as this Edenic ideal.
Yeah.
When you have a group of people who are starting to promote something because they just say it to be so, it can affect a lot of things. And
you got us, John. We just show up here and we say it to be so.
Talk about throwing rocks in a glass house.
Oh man. Okay, let's keep going.
The old log in your own eye.
About vegetarianism and him being in a scene and all these things, they are affecting people in negative ways, in my opinion, because they're not talking about being here now. They're talking about the things you have to do to reach something ahead of you.
But you've never watched any of our podcasts, so you wouldn't even know if we talk about being here now or if we talk about trying to get to things ahead of you. I mean, these are just like laughable, cartoonish strawmans. If you watch any of our podcasts, you would know that the whole premise of the podcast is love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And there is no greater commandment than that, to ground you into the present moment. So just because we want to increase in our righteousness does not mean we're seeking something outside of ourselves. It means we're devoted to our love for God and neighbor to be better and better each day. not to earn something or to get some approval, but because we love God with all our heart. And I think even John would probably agree with that.
And I had bought a book called Edgar Casey on the Millennium, a little paperback book. And I'm like, whatever. I'm just going to see what he's going to say about the millennium. And I opened it up to page 32. And right in the middle of the page, it says, John the Beloved will again be named John. And I'm like, Edgar Casey was known as the sleeping prophet, known for his trance readings. And if you take Casey as 100% infallible, then you're making the same mistake that religions make about their Bibles and their Korans, right? They're all flawed.
So I had to put that one in there because that was a little curious, right? He's kind of besmirching Edgar Casey as untrustworthy, unreliable. And then in another podcast on Alex Ferrari, he talked about how the kind of final confirming thing for him was reading in an Edgar Casey book. The beloved, John the Beloved will again be named John. So it's like, which is it, right? Is it reliable or not? And he'll do this with like the Greek Gospels as well, where he'll say, oh, those Greek Gospels, you can't trust them. They've been altered by scribes. And like we agree to a large extent. But then when he wants to say Jesus ate flesh, he'll quote John 21 when Jesus eats fish. You know, it's like, but I thought you said it wasn't reliable. So it's like appeal to it when it works for you and don't when it doesn't. And then there was another one where he said, recently scholars, actually Dr. Tabor showed us this on a private Zoom call, guys, that they found a ancient heel bone from a crucifixion victim where it was clear that they had drilled the nails on the side of the cross into both feet. So rather than the traditional artistic depictions of Jesus on the cross with one nail through both feet, historians now know actually crucifixion in Rome was done with the heels drilled into the side of the cross. And so in one video I watched, I heard him say, he cited this fact of, oh, we know that, you know, they would be crucified with their heel bones on either side. But then in another interview, he says that he had a vision as John looking up to Jesus on the cross, and Jesus was looking down at him saying, I love you like the most, you're my most beloved disciple, John. And then he says that he looked and he saw how much suffering Jesus would have been in. And he says, all of that weight coming down on one nail as it's traditionally depicted. And I thought, but in another interview, you said that it was both feet with two nails. So I'm not like trying to make any accusations. It's just, it's difficult when there's different claims being made. And again, we're supposed to keep believing in the private visions when even some cursory claims show themselves to be contradictory.
The whole story of the virgin birth. You have to remember that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, theologians and Bible scholars believe they are written from one source. They don't believe they're written by the individuals.
So the claim we're focusing in here is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Theologians and scholars think they were all written from one source. So I really don't know where John gets this idea from, but it definitely doesn't come from studying biblical scholarship, because there are no Bible scholars, Christian or secular, who believe that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all written from one source. What I think John might be thinking of is the Q hypothesis, which says that Matthew and Luke share a lot of unique material in common that's not in Mark. And so scholars hypothesize that there must have been an earlier source that Matthew and Luke both used, which they call Q, which is now lost to history. But Matthew and Luke both used Mark, and then some other source like Q. And then there's also M and L, which is material unique to Matthew and Luke, that also may have probably came from a different source. And especially with L, the L source, called Special Luke, has an extremely high number of Semitisms in it, which probably shows us that it was copied from a Hebrew or Aramaic gospel, like the Hebrew gospel of Matthew, which John also said never existed. So you don't even need to study biblical scholarship to know that this claim isn't true, because Luke opens his gospel in the very first verse by saying that he wrote this gospel based on many other source texts which came before him. Here it is from Luke chapter 1. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those from the first eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So right here, he says, many have undertaken to write accounts of Jesus, of what was fulfilled. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, meaning every source from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So Luke famously said that he wrote his gospel from many of the accounts that existed in his time. So it's definitely not true to say that all three synoptic gospels were written from one source. And it's not as if this is some huge point, but the reason we highlight this is because John continues to say that we don't know what we're talking about and we're making things up when he continually gets basic biblical facts like this wrong, which doesn't lend great credibility to his claims about being John the Beloved.
Because he didn't believe in a Messiah. He didn't believe in a Savior. One of the real memories that I have is avoiding the Essenes, because they wanted him to not only take the role of Messiah, but they wanted him to take the role of king. And they wanted him to actually raise an army and fight Rome. And he wouldn't do it. And so we avoided the Essene encampment because it was like, they want me to do something I'm not going to do.
Okay.
Wow, that's some sheer confidence.
Yeah.
I mean, or maybe it's not. I don't know.
Seems confident. But so here's the claim we're going to zero in on. One of the memories I have is of avoiding the Essenes. So he's claiming this from his memories, that from his memories, the Essenes wanted to make Jesus a king to militarily overthrow Rome. And Jesus didn't want to do that, so they avoided the Essene encampment, he says. And we know the Essenes weren't an encampment. It was a widespread movement throughout all the Transjordan with many different groups. But let's just mention a couple things about why this is obviously historically false. This claim is really about as wrong as possible because the Essenes were the most pacifistic, anti-establishment, anti-militaristic group of anyone in their day. They refused to bear arms and famously had no weapons in their encampment. And the Essenes have quite a bit of apocalyptic literature, since they had a very imminent eschatology, just like Jesus and John the Baptist, which is another parallel. But nowhere in any of the doom literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls does it say anything about a king rising up to fight Rome, or that they even wanted one. So I don't know where he would justify that claim historically, because the Essenes very specifically believed that the angels of God would come down to fight on their behalf and destroy Rome for them without them having to fight. And so, as Edgar Casey rightfully said, the Essenes did expect a Messiah, not a militaristic king. There is no textual evidence that the Essenes expected or wanted a militaristic king. All three of our first century historians say they were strict pacifists. So this memory of the Essenes wanting to make Jesus a military king is roundly refuted by all the historical evidence we have. Okay, so now let's look at some of the shorts that John posted, trying to debunk some of our claims here.
Jewish sects within Judaism during the time of Jeshua. There were 4 Jewish sects that we know of. There were probably more.
Man, every time he says Jeshua, it's like nails on a chalkboard.
We had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. And the Zealots actually had a different name. Zealots became a name later used for them. He also wrote about the Essenes, but he talked about the Essenes being an isolationist cult that kept themselves away from other people, which would have meant that Jeshua's public teaching would have been completely against the Essene teachings. The only documented Essene writings there are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are of the Jewish faith, because they're the Essenes were very much not only isolationists but extreme followers of the laws of Judaism.
So here's the claim we're zeroing in on. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written on goatskin, sheepskin, and cowhide. So if they were vegetarian, do you think they just tried to let the animal live without its skin? Or do you think that they ate the meat? So I love this kind of false dilemma he paints here. Either the Essenes skinned their animals alive and let them walk around with no skin, or they ate the meat. It's like either the Essenes cooked their vegetables or they ate them. Not exactly a strong logical argument. To say that the Essenes wrote their scrolls on leather parchment like everybody else in the ancient world means that they definitely sacrificed and ate animals is a logical fallacy called affirming the consequent. You have no way of proving your conclusion, but you just affirm it to be true anyway. We know that the Essenes rejected animal sacrifice and flesh consumption. There is no question about that. So you have to disprove the other logical possibilities before you just affirm your conclusion. And the most obvious alternative conclusion is that all animals die eventually. So there's no need to murder them in order to write on their skins. Many Dead Sea Scroll scholars like Robert Eisenman, John Marco Allegro, James Tabor, Giza Vermes, all believe that the Essenes were attempting to restore the Edenic ideal from Genesis 1 and Isaiah 11, where there's no violence or harm toward animals. So the Essenes could have just as likely used the skins of their deceased animals to write their scrolls with, since leather parchment is much stronger material that preserves much longer than papyrus does. Papyrus was really troublesome material to preserve texts on in the Middle East because of the intense heat and humidity. So that's why virtually all ancient Jewish texts are written on leather parchment. But there's strong archaeological evidence as well that the Essenes kept animals. And if the Essenes loved and cared for their animals, then they probably would have seen writing their scrolls on their skins as a sacred way of honoring their animals by preserving their holy texts on their skins. Not that that's necessarily needed for our argument, but it is likely the case. So when you use historical critical methods, you always have to weigh the strongest evidence first. And that is numerous first century historians and the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves say that the Essenes rejected animal sacrifice and only ate simple food, bread and vegetables and so forth.
And all through the teaching. So for him to likely be an Essene is almost impossible to believe. Number two, the modern New Age apologists are choosing a belief and then they're filling in gaps with their own dogma. And this concept of Jesus being a vegetarian does not come from Essene writings, because the only Essene writings we have are the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it literally comes from Theosophical Society teaching.
Man, he's just got like his 3 arguments and it's just like rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat.
And the vegetarianism that they were pushing because they were trying to marry Hinduism with Christianity. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written on goatskin, sheepskin, and cowhide. So if they were vegetarian, do you think they just tried to let the animal live without its skin? Or do you think they ate the meat? It really comes down to understanding that I don't care what your faith is, what your belief is, but if you're trying to push people to believe something just because you believe it, you're an apologist. You're someone who's trying to say, you have to believe this because of this, and you're filling in gaps with documents and ideas that don't exist in history.
Now we'll look at the one that John actually posted today, as of the day of this recording at least.
So there are several New Age apologists that claim that Jesus' followers, the Nazarenes, were Essenes. And this could not be further from the truth, and it's not shown in history anywhere. The word Nazarene means follower of Jesus of Nazareth. So they would have been very much about the teachings of Jeshua ben Joseph, the man who was the Nazarene. Who were the Essenes? The Essenes were an isolationist Jewish sect that were following the laws of Moses rigidly. And in the laws of Judaism, which is what they were following, they would have followed very closely to what was laid out in Leviticus that has a full page of animals you can eat, and the ones you.
So he says here the Essenes followed what was written out in Leviticus, even to kill and slaughter animals, sacrifice animals, which we know the Essenes were definitely against.
Wow.
So that's kind of a wild claim.
Should avoid because they're unclean. So everything he did absolutely would have been against Essene teachings. The idea that Jeshua was an Essene is ridiculous. The idea that the Nazarenes were Essenes is just as ridiculous, because the idea that they would do everything against what the Essenes taught and still be Essenes makes no sense. And that's my thought on the
So it's like, wow, again, the Essenes, Jesus and the Essenes did not practice anything in common. We've absolutely nuked that presupposition today. But even to say that Nazarenes means those who follow Jesus of Nazareth.
The word Nazarene means follower of Jesus of Nazareth.
It's like, so, okay, we have the sign of Jesus being crucified. Above him says, Jesus the Nazarene, which means Jesus, the one who followed Jesus of Nazareth. That is not what Nazarenes means. Nazarene comes from the Hebrew word notzrim, which means keepers of the covenant, which again goes back to the Jeremiah-Isaiah parallel, that they were trying to preserve the original law of Moses, the 10 Commandments, before it got infiltrated and corrupted by the lying pen of the scribes and animal sacrifices. So no, Nazarenes doesn't mean followers of Jesus. The Nazarene sect was before Christ. And as Josephus and Epiphanius show, that the Essenes who may have written some of the sectarian documents split into those two groups, Nazarenes and Essenes to the south, and Jesus emerged from the northern branch. So Nazarenes weren't Essenes because that's an anachronism, but they were a sect of the Essene type of Judaism without question.
Yeah, and we've cited Epiphanius, church fathers. We've cited literally the Gospels themselves, pointing to the sectarian spelling of the Nazarene all over the place. And we've even attested to secular, resources like Pliny the Elder, who puts the Nazarene, or the Tetrarchy of the Nazarenorum, in southern Syria and the Transjordan all the way back to 30 BC. But if that's not enough, one interesting one that I came across not too long ago, but kind of pushed aside because I wasn't sure how early of a dating we had for it, is the Gospel of Philip, which I encourage everyone to go check out because the scholarship coming out around the Gospel of Philip right now is explosive. It's being put way earlier than we ever thought. It's being put in Aramaic, not just Coptic, because of the Semitisms and everything that are coming out of that. And the Gospel of Philip famously states the title of the Nazarene being the keeper or the revealer of truth as a title, not as someone from Nazareth. And famously, the Gospel of Philip condemns animal sacrifice as something that's actually demonic, that it's a practice that feeds these archons as they come to be later known, the principalities. Paul and some of the early Christians talked about this, that those are who you're making the sacrifices to when you're making animal sacrifices. So we've got gospel attestation from our canonical gospels. We've got secular attestation. We've got attestation from the patristics, and even these, outlier texts that are, have deemed to be much later that are now being proven to be earlier. It's like the information and the proof just keeps coming down the pipeline. It's undeniable.
It really is, man. It's super inspiring to uncover this lost history and realize that there's way more here than we've ever thought before in Christian history. And whether it's James, his brother Simeon, who succeeded James in the Nazarene church, there is a lost Jesus dynasty that no one ever talks about, except for scholars like James Tabor, thank God, who are pulling out this amazing history of Jesus's church, the Ebionim of the Nazarenes, who Jesus appointed his brother to succeed him as the leader of, and he led the church until 64 AD when he's martyred, not committed suicide. And then he appoints his brother Simeon, also the half-brother of Jesus, to succeed him, and he continues into about 115 CE. And then Simeon is martyred, according to Hegesippus, at 120 years old. Just like all the Essenes, as Philo and Josephus say, they live to be an average age of 100 years old or more. So we have so many Essene connections, it takes many, many hours to break them all down. So I appreciate you guys joining me today to do a small smattering of the evidence to show these parallels, which I think, again, is very important for the sake of resurrecting forgotten history of the Jesus movement. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. I think we've been through enough videos and proofs now, but I'll pitch it to you guys if you want to say any final closing words before we conclude the podcast.
Yeah, I think we made a compelling argument that Jesus was from this Essene philosophical tradition. Now, again, we're not saying he was a card-carrying member of the Essenes. It's like, for instance, someone can have, libertarian beliefs, and that doesn't mean they're a member of the libertarian political party. Someone could even have libertarian beliefs and not like the libertarian political party. So what we're saying is this is a philosophical stream of consciousness. Okay, you have the group, and then you have the philosophy. And, John talks about how the Essenes were more, ascetic and isolationist. And that could have been one point of contention. Jesus is like, let's go into Jerusalem and speak the truth to people. And the Essenes were like, nah, it's hopeless. Let's stay out here. So we're not even saying John's wrong about everything, but it is undeniable that when you look at the different Jewish groups, Jesus most closely aligns with the Essene vegetarian ideal, and that's all we're saying. John, we love you. We wish you the best. We're just responding. You were attacking us. We're responding to it, but that doesn't mean we don't like you or anything. We genuinely wish all human beings in the world the very best, and that's it.
Well said, brother. Thank you for that. And Cam, I'll pitch to you, man. Any last words?
Yeah, I'd love to just offer two final Steelman proofs to close with that I think really is going to be something that John would have to deal with his counterclaims, which is that Jesus was an Essene, aka a Nazarene, which is what we're saying, because the Essene claim we've proven is a bit of a straw man terminology, and that he wasn't a vegetarian. And that is that, with where he's landed now in that last video that we watched, he's really hanging his hat on that Jesus is from Nazareth and that the Nazarenes just mean the people who follow the guy from Nazareth. We've given a lot of proofs. One that we didn't give, though, that I think is one of the most undeniable of all, to prove that the Nazarenes were a sect predating Jesus, and that comes from a secular source. You were just mentioning Pliny earlier, Aaron, and Pliny writes in his Natural History that there is the Tetrarchy of the Nazarini, which is southern Syria down to the Transjordan, the way that he geographically locates it, which is the same place that Epiphanius says the Nazarenes existed before Christ. So we have religious attestation and we have secular attestation, which Pliny's writing in 50 AD, but he's using census records all the way back to 30 or 50 BC. So we've got this Nazarene community and geographical location associated with Pliny. So that's some of the best sourcing that you can get for this. So I don't know. I would love for John or anyone else out there, if you're listening to this and you fall in the camp of Jesus was from Nazareth and that's all Nazarene means, can you please explain what Pliny's referring to from 30 BC? And then outside of that, in terms of the vegetarian claim, again, I just want to reemphasize that this is a straw man in its own way of the position that we take and the position that we believe Jesus and the Nazarenes took, that it's not a dietary preference or some kind of secret code to unlock the kingdoms of heaven or something. I believe that there's aspects to that, but the reality is it's a moral framework. And what I'd love to appeal to for that is just the reminder that the first and greatest commandment in Genesis is the commandment for dominion, which, we've always heard is this kind of tyranny, but really that word yeridu, dominion, really comes from the root yerad, which means to lower oneself in service to. It's service to creation. And even like you pointed out, Aaron, with the bones that they're putting and they're burying their own animals, it's like these people had a high regard for creation, the same way Jesus is speaking of the sparrow in the Sermon on the Mount. And across the board, you see this ethic of this golden rule axiom. And I really feel Jesus expresses it best in the Gospel of John, ironically, that, John claims to have a past life memory of being. He says that in John 10:10 through 11, I say this on most of our podcasts because I think it's just one of the best verses there is. He says, the enemy comes to steal, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And that word kill is slaying animals. Literally, thysia is what the Greek means. But I have come to bring life and life abundantly. I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays his life down for the sheep. So this is Jesus exemplifying to the nth degree with such poetic beauty this idea of the two ways philosophy that we talk about. There's the way of death and the way of life. He's choosing and showing and exemplifying the way of life. And a major component to that is service to others. I will lay my life down for the sheep, not just humans. And we know this is a metaphor for the lost tribes of Israel and all that as well. But I think it's also literal in the sense that the lambs were being slaughtered in the temple when he overturned the tables and said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So I think in so many ways, what I want to sum up is that, to play off of James, and our sentiment is like, we're not here to make fun of John or to, there is some really wild statements he's making, but we want to appeal to you, John, like refute our arguments. If you can find any means to disprove anything that we've shared, share that. But this private vision stuff and claiming things that we've never claimed is not an argument. And I think that if you, John, or anyone who's listening will just go, we're here to present information. We're not here actually to evangelize anyone to believe what we believe. This is something that we came into through our own study, and we encourage everyone to study it for themselves. And don't just listen to everyone out there on the internet because, there's a lot of ways that we can all be misled in that way. So that's where I'd love to close it. John, we send you love, brother. And, like Aaron said, you asked in a way for us to respond to this, and here's our response. So by all means, let us know what you think about it.
Yeah, really well said, Cam. And I want to echo what you and James have said here as we close, that we're really grateful, John, for this opportunity to have this fun debate and go back and forth on showing our evidence. And even though there may have been some bad blood because of the summit, like on our end, brother, it's nothing but love and forgiveness. It's all good. We forgive you for the claims you made about us being New Age apologists, making things up, being dangerous. We understand where these things may have come from. And really, more than anything, like, thank you for the opportunity to steelman our arguments here and further show why we're championing this message to the public, that it really is a big deal of the historical origins of Yeshua and what that means for the Jesus way. And so, although we love geeking out on Bible history and scholarship, all the attestations we've shown are just secondary to this message. The message is clear. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. So go out, everyone, and do that and live that, and you are walking the Jesus way. We'll see you all on the next episode of the Jesus Way podcast. Peace and love.